Welcome to the Midnight Echoes. Before we dive into tonight's stories, I'd love to know, where are you watching from and what time is it there? Drop a comment below. It's always fascinating to see where our viewers are tuning in from. If you enjoy the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Now let's get comfortable, unwind, and prepare for tonight's eerie adventures. I'd been commuting on the old railway line for years, catching the late-night train after long shifts at work. It was quiet, peaceful even, with few passengers riding so late. But one night, something felt different. As the train pulled into an abandoned station I'd passed dozens of times before, the doors slid open, and a group of passengers stepped on. There was something off about them, something chilling. They were silent, their faces hidden in the shadows, their movements unnaturally stiff. I watched them find seats, but none of them made eye contact. I brushed it off, telling myself I was just tired, but a sense of unease settled over me. For the next few nights, the same thing happened. The train would stop at the abandoned station, and those strange passengers would board again. Always silent, always disappearing into the far corners of the car. Their presence sent a shiver down my spine, but they never seemed to notice me, and no one else on the train reacted to them. It was as if I was the only one who saw them. Then, one night, I couldn't help but stare. As we passed through a tunnel, the lights flickered, and in the brief flashes of darkness, I could see their faces, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. My heart raced as I realized these passengers weren't normal. They were something else, something eerie and haunting. I began asking around about the abandoned station, hoping for some kind of explanation. An old conductor, one of the few who'd worked the line for decades, told me a story that made my blood run cold. Years ago, there had been a terrible accident. A train had derailed at that very station, killing dozens of passengers. The station had been closed ever since, left to rot along with the memories of that night. But some said the spirits of the victims never left. The next time I boarded the train, I couldn't stop thinking about the accident. My eyes were glued to the station as we approached, waiting for those ghostly passengers to appear again. And sure enough, as the train pulled in, they stepped on, their movements stiff, their eyes vacant. This time, though, one of them sat directly across from me. I held my breath, trying not to panic, but I could feel their gaze on me. The lights flickered again, and in the brief moment of darkness, I saw it clearly. Her face, pale and twisted with fear, as if she were still trapped in the moment of her death. The train ride felt like an eternity, and when it finally pulled into my stop, I bolted off without looking back. My heart was pounding, and my hands were shaking. I had seen enough. But the haunting wasn't over. The next night, the train didn't stop at the abandoned station, but I still saw them. The passengers, standing outside the window as we sped past, their faces pressed against the glass watching me. Their eyes filled with an unspoken demand. I knew then that I couldn't just ignore what was happening. These spirits were trapped, reliving their final moments over and over, and somehow I had become part of their loop. Desperate for answers, I returned to the site of the derailment during the day. The station was crumbling, overgrown with weeds, but as I walked along the tracks, I felt the presence of something dark lingering in the air. The closer I got to the wreck site, the heavier the atmosphere became. I could hear faint whispers, almost like distant cries for help. That night, I boarded the train again, determined to confront the spirits. As we approached the station, I stood up and walked toward the doors, even though my stop was still far ahead. When the train pulled in, the doors opened, but this time, I didn't just watch. I stepped out onto the platform where the ghostly passengers stood, waiting. The air was cold, unnaturally so, and the silence was suffocating. One of the spirits, the woman with the pale face, turned to me, her eyes hollow, and whispered, "We're still here." I didn't know what to say, my throat dry with fear, but I nodded, acknowledging their presence, and for a brief moment the air around me felt lighter. The spirits didn't move, but I could feel their desperation, their need to be remembered, to have their tragedy acknowledged. The train's doors closed behind me, and I stood there alone on the platform, staring at the figures as they slowly faded into the shadows. I haven't taken that train since. I can't. Every time I think about it, I remember the faces of those passengers, still trapped in the moment of their deaths, still riding that midnight train. I wonder if they'll ever find peace, or if they're destined to haunt that old line forever. Some nights, when I lie in bed, I can still hear the faint rumble of the train passing by, and I wonder if they're waiting for me to join them again. Inheriting Rosecliff House felt like a dream come true. The sprawling estate with its ivy-covered walls and expansive garden had been in my family for generations. My husband and I were eager to restore the place to its former glory. The house had been empty for years, neglected and overgrown, but there was something about it that drew us in, especially the garden. Hidden behind the estate, it was wild and untamed, with flowers blooming in chaotic bursts of color. It had a strange allure, as if it had a life of its own, calling us to bring it back to life. We spent weeks working on the house, but the garden always seemed to demand our attention. Every time we cleared away the overgrown plants, new flowers would bloom overnight, almost as if the garden was fighting to remain hidden. One day, while digging near an old, crumbling fountain, we made a chilling discovery. A row of old, weathered gravestones hidden beneath the thick layers of moss and dirt. There were no names, just faded dates carved into the stone, marking lives long forgotten. That night, as we sat in the house, a cold breeze swept through, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of roses. It was strange. None of the roses in the garden had bloomed yet. But the scent lingered, following us through the halls. My husband laughed it off, saying it was just the wind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of being watched, as if the garden's secrets had begun to stir. As the days passed, things began to change in the house. The once warm and welcoming rooms grew cold, and shadows seemed to move on their own. Every night, at exactly midnight, we'd hear soft whispers coming from the garden. I'd look out the window, expecting to see animals or the wind moving through the trees. But there was nothing, just the faint rustle of leaves and the scent of roses, growing stronger with each passing night. One evening as I was walking through the garden, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The flowers, which had once been so beautiful, now looked wilted and decayed, their petals falling away as I passed. I heard footsteps behind me and spun around, but no one was there. The air grew colder, and I could feel a presence watching me, something unseen but undeniably there. I hurried back to the house, but the feeling of being followed never left me. We decided to consult the local historian, hoping to learn more about Rosecliff's past. What he told us was chilling. The garden, he said, had once been a burial ground for those who had died under mysterious circumstances. The house's previous owners had buried their secrets along with the bodies, hoping to leave the past behind. But the spirits of the dead had never left. They were tied to the land, their unfinished business haunting the estate, waiting for someone to uncover the truth. After hearing the story, the hauntings grew more intense. Every night, the whispers grew louder, and the scent of roses became overwhelming, almost suffocating. Objects in the house would move on their own, and the shadows in the garden seemed to take on human shapes, flitting between the trees. It was as if the spirits of those buried in the garden were trying to reach out, desperate to be acknowledged, to have their stories told. One night, as the clock struck midnight, I woke to the sound of soft weeping coming from the garden. I crept to the window and saw them, figures moving among the flowers, their forms barely visible in the moonlight. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothes, their faces pale and sorrowful. My heart raced as I watched them, knowing that these were the spirits tied to the graves we had uncovered. They were waiting for something, but I didn't know what. Desperate to end the hauntings, my husband and I decided to return to the garden, hoping to find some way to put the spirits to rest. As we dug deeper around the gravestones, we uncovered old letters and personal belongings buried alongside the bodies, tokens of lives that had been cut short, secrets that had been hidden away for generations. It was clear now that the spirits were tied to these items, unable to move on until their stories were told. With the historian's help, We held a small ceremony, acknowledging the lives of those buried in the garden and promising to keep their memory alive. As we placed the letters and belongings back into the earth, the air around us seemed to lighten. The scent of roses faded, and the whispers finally stopped. For the first time since we had arrived, Rosecliff House felt peaceful. We left the garden that night, knowing that we had uncovered something far darker than we had ever imagined. The spirits of Rosecliff had found peace, but the house would never be the same. Even now, years later, I sometimes catch the faint scent of roses on the wind, and I wonder if the garden is still waiting, still holding on to secrets yet to be discovered. When I first moved into the old townhouse, I was enchanted by its charm. It was a bit run down, with creaky floors and peeling wallpaper, but I loved the character it had. The attic, though, was another story. From the moment I stepped foot in the house, I felt something off about that space. It was dark and cluttered, filled with old furniture and boxes, like a room forgotten by time. But it wasn't just the atmosphere that unsettled me. It was the strange noises I started hearing at night. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but the more I listened, the clearer it became. The noises weren't random. They were whispers. I told myself it was my imagination. I had just moved in, and it was an old house after all. But the whispers grew louder with each passing night. They started out faint, barely audible, like someone talking from far away. But soon, they became more distinct. They were calling my name. It sent a chill down my spine. I wasn't the type to believe in ghosts, but it was hard to ignore the eerie feeling that washed over me every time the whispers started. One night, I decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, I made my way up the narrow staircase to the attic. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of something musty filled my nose. The whispers seemed to stop the moment I opened the attic door. I shone my flashlight around, half expecting to find something, or someone, hiding in the shadows. But there was nothing. Just old furniture draped in white sheets and piles of forgotten belongings. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. Tucked behind an old trunk was a small, leather-bound diary. It looked ancient, its pages yellowed and brittle. Curiosity got the best of me, and I opened it. The entries were written in a delicate hand, belonging to a woman named Alice, who had lived in the house many years ago. As I read, a sense of dread settled over me. Alice's last entries were filled with paranoia and fear. She wrote about hearing voices in the attic, whispers that called her name, just like what I was experiencing. The next few nights were worse. The whispers grew more persistent, sometimes waking me in the middle of the night. I could hear them forming words now, though I couldn't always understand them. It was as if they were trying to tell me something, but the more I listened, the more I felt trapped, like the voices wanted something from me. I thought about leaving, but part of me couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to stay, that I needed to figure out what was going on. As I delved deeper into Alice's diary, I learned that she had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. No one knew what had happened to her, but her last entries hinted at something dark. She wrote about feeling watched, about hearing the whispers telling her to do things. The more I read, the more I realized that Alice hadn't left the house at all. She had never truly left the attic. The whispers became louder, more insistent. They didn't just come at night anymore. They followed me throughout the day, soft and persistent, like a constant presence hovering just out of sight. I began seeing shadows in the corner of my vision, flickering just out of reach. The attic door would creak open on its own, as if inviting me back. I was being drawn in, just like Alice had been. One night, unable to ignore the pull any longer, I climbed back up to the attic. This time I felt different. More determined, but also more afraid. The whispers were louder now, clearer. They called my name, over and over. My hands shook as I searched the attic, looking for some sign of Alice. That's when I found it. Behind a false wall, hidden beneath floorboards, was Alice's old, crumbling diary, filled with the final words she had never shared. In her last entry, she wrote that the voices weren't just in her head. They were coming from the house itself, trying to claim her. As I read her words, I felt a cold hand brush against my neck. The attic door slammed shut behind me, and the air grew thick with the sound of whispers, louder than ever. They weren't just calling my name anymore. They were demanding something. I could feel the weight of the house pressing down on me, its presence suffocating. The whispers had become screams, and in that moment, I knew the truth. Alice hadn't disappeared. She had been taken by the house, just like it was trying to take me. I don't remember how I got out of the attic. I ran, my heart pounding, and left the house that night, never to return. I later learned that every tenant before me had experienced the same thing. The whispers, the strange happenings, the feeling of being watched. The house had a hold on people, and once it had you, it didn't want to let go. I'm still haunted by the sound of those whispers, by the feeling of cold hands brushing against me in the night. I wonder if Alice is still there, trapped in the attic, her voice lost among the others. And sometimes, when the night is quiet, I can still hear it. Faint whispers calling my name, as if the house hasn't quite let me go. We moved to the cabin to escape the chaos of the city. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a peaceful retreat in the middle of the forest where we could reconnect as a family. The cabin was perfect, rustic, cozy, and nestled in a quiet clearing surrounded by towering pines. At first, everything seemed ideal. The kids loved exploring the woods, and my husband and I enjoyed the silence. But soon, strange things started happening, and what was meant to be an escape turned into something far more chilling. It began with our youngest, Lily. One evening, as we sat around the campfire roasting marshmallows, she pointed toward the tree line and said, "There's a man over there." We all turned, but there was no one. The forest was still, with nothing but the sound of the crackling fire. My husband and I exchanged uneasy glances, but we brushed it off, telling Lily she was just imagining things. But the look in her eyes, wide and serious, left me feeling unsettled. Over the next few days, Lily kept talking about the Shadow Man. She said he stood just at the edge of the forest, watching the cabin. At first, we thought she was making up a story, but the way she described him, tall, dark, without a face, made my skin crawl. I'd find her staring out the window, her little face pressed against the glass, watching the woods. "He's out there again," she'd whisper. I started feeling paranoid, always glancing toward the trees, but I never saw anything. Not yet. One night, while lying in bed, I heard footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate crunches of leaves and twigs. My heart raced as I sat up, straining to hear more. I nudged my husband awake, but when we both peered out the window, there was nothing but darkness. The footsteps stopped, leaving behind an eerie silence. I convinced myself it was an animal, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next day, the woods seemed different, darker, heavier. Even the air felt thick, like we were being watched. The kids stayed close to the cabin, no longer eager to explore. That afternoon, while I was chopping firewood, I glanced up and saw it. A figure standing between the trees, just beyond the clearing. My heart skipped a beat. It was just as Lily had described. Tall, dark, and featureless, blending with the shadows of the forest. I blinked, and he was gone. But the feeling of being watched lingered. That night, things escalated. As we sat down to dinner, the lights flickered, and the temperature in the cabin dropped suddenly. The windows rattled as a cold breeze swept through, even though the doors were locked. Lily whispered, "He's here," her voice trembling. My husband checked the windows and doors, but everything was secure. Yet the sense of dread that filled the cabin was undeniable. The shadow wasn't just in the woods anymore. It was getting closer. The following morning, we found strange footprints circling the cabin. They were large, too large to be human, and they led deep into the forest, disappearing among the trees. My husband wanted to follow them, but I begged him not to. Something about those tracks felt wrong, unnatural. We decided to stay inside for the rest of the day, but the oppressive feeling of being watched grew stronger, suffocating us. Every creak, every gust of wind sent my heart racing. By the time night fell, the tension in the cabin was unbearable. The kids were terrified, and even my husband, who usually remained calm, seemed on edge. As darkness settled over the forest, the shadow appeared again, this time closer. It stood just beyond the porch, its figure barely visible in the dim light. We all saw it, frozen in place as it watched us from the shadows. My husband grabbed a flashlight and ran outside, but as soon as the beam of light hit the trees, the figure vanished. We couldn't stay there any longer. The next morning we packed up and left, unable to shake the feeling that something sinister had been lurking in the woods, watching us, waiting. As we drove away, I glanced back one last time, half expecting to see the shadow standing in the clearing. It wasn't there, but the forest felt darker, more menacing, as though it had swallowed the figure whole. Even now, I can't forget the feeling of those eyes, or whatever they were, following us. We never went back to the cabin. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, certain that I can hear those slow footsteps outside my window. And I wonder if the shadow followed us, waiting for the right moment to make itself known again. We had been planning the camping trip for months. It was supposed to be a fun weekend, a group of close friends getting away from everything for a few days in the woods. We chose a spot near an old abandoned church that the locals warned us to avoid, but we thought nothing of it. People in small towns always had their spooky stories, and we figured this one was just that. Besides, the idea of camping near a forgotten piece of history intrigued us. Little did we know, that church was more than just an eerie relic. It was the center of something far more sinister. On our first night there, we found strange carvings on the walls of the church. The symbols were unfamiliar, spirals and strange markings etched into the stone. We laughed it off, guessing they were left behind by some bored teenagers trying to scare anyone who stumbled upon the place. But as we stood there in the fading light of the evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest around us was silent, almost too still. I shrugged it off and returned to the campsite, but the unease lingered. As the night fell, the moon rose, a blood moon, glowing deep red in the sky. It was a rare occurrence, and we marveled at its eerie beauty. But with the blood moon came a strange atmosphere, like the air itself was charged with something dark. The temperature dropped, and an unsettling quiet settled over the woods. We huddled around the fire, trying to shake off the creeping sense of dread that had fallen over us. That's when we heard the chanting. At first, it was faint, just a whisper carried on the wind. But as the night wore on, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from the direction of the church. My friend Sam, always the skeptic, insisted it was just the wind playing tricks on us. But deep down, we all knew that wasn't true. The voices were real, low and rhythmic, chanting in a language none of us understood. We were too scared to investigate, so we stayed close to the fire, hoping the sounds would stop. They didn't. The next morning, we found strange symbols drawn in the dirt around our campsite, similar to the carvings we had seen on the church walls. None of us had drawn them, and there were no signs that anyone else had been there during the night. The mood shifted from nervous excitement to fear. We tried to laugh it off, but the tension was thick, and the unease from the night before hadn't faded. That evening, as the blood moon rose again, the chanting started earlier, louder and closer this time. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as though the forest was closing in around us. We decided to stay inside our tents, hoping to block out the sounds, but the chanting was relentless. It circled our camp, moving through the trees like an unseen force. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the terror setting in. Something was happening, something we didn't understand. Around midnight, one of our friends, Rachel, went missing. We tore through the woods, calling her name, but she was gone without a trace. Panic set in. We searched for hours, but there was no sign of her. As the night dragged on, we realized the truth. She had been taken. Whatever ritual was unfolding beneath the blood moon had chosen her, and we were powerless to stop it. Desperate, we gathered around the fire, waiting for the dawn, hoping that daylight would bring safety. But it didn't. The following night, the chanting returned, louder and more frenzied. This time, it wasn't just a distant echo, it was all around us. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and something metallic, like blood. My friend Jake, who had always been the calmest of us, broke down, insisting we leave immediately. But it was too late. The forest itself seemed to close in on us, the trees towering over like dark sentinels, and the path back to the road was gone. As the moon reached its highest point, we saw them, figures emerging from the shadows. They were cloaked in darkness, their faces hidden, moving silently through the trees toward us. My heart raced, my mind screaming to run, but my body wouldn't move. It was as if the ground itself had swallowed us, trapping us in place. One by one, my friends vanished, pulled into the shadows without a sound, their screams swallowed by the night. I was the last one left. As the figures closed in, I realized the truth. This was an ancient ritual, a sacrifice tied to the blood moon. We had stumbled into something far older and darker than we could have ever imagined, and now we were the chosen offerings. The blood moon hung overhead, casting its eerie red glow over the scene as the chanting reached a fever pitch. And then, there was nothing. I don't know how I survived. The next thing I remember is waking up at dawn, alone in the clearing. My friends were gone, the campsite was destroyed, and the symbols drawn in the dirt were burning with an unnatural heat. I fled the forest that day and never looked back. I later learned that every blood moon, the woods around that abandoned church have claimed lives, pulling unsuspecting campers into an ancient, deadly ritual. I can still hear the chanting sometimes in the dead of night, and I wonder if the blood moon will rise again, and if I'll be the next one to disappear. The seaside bed and breakfast was everything we'd hoped for, quaint, quiet, and right by the shore. My husband and I had booked it for a long weekend getaway, excited for a few days of peace away from the city. The owners were friendly, though the old woman who ran the place seemed wary when we mentioned visiting the abandoned lighthouse nearby. "Best stay away from that place," she had warned us, her voice low. "It's haunted, you know. No one's been up there since the last keeper disappeared." We laughed it off. An old lighthouse haunted by its missing keeper? It sounded like one of those local legends meant to scare tourists. But curiosity got the best of us. On our second day, we decided to hike up to the lighthouse, its tall, weathered silhouette visible in the distance from our bedroom window. The path was overgrown, and by the time we reached the base of the structure, the air had grown cooler, almost unnaturally so. The lighthouse towered above us, its windows dark and lifeless. A strange chill ran down my spine as we stepped closer. Inside, the place was just as abandoned as we'd expected. Dust-covered floors, peeling paint, and furniture left behind, as though the keeper had simply vanished in the middle of the night. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were trespassing on something, as though the lighthouse itself was watching us. We wandered through the lower rooms, finding nothing more than old logs and forgotten tools. But then, we found the diary. It was tucked away in a drawer in the old keeper's office. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but the handwriting was clear. It belonged to the last keeper, a man named Thomas, who had worked at the lighthouse until the night he disappeared. His entries started off normal, routine notes about the weather, the ships he saw passing by. But as the days wore on, his tone shifted. He wrote about hearing strange noises at night, footsteps on the stairs, the sound of the lantern being lit when no one was around. As I read further, the entries became more frantic. Thomas began writing about seeing a figure outside the lighthouse, a man standing at the edge of the shore, staring up at the tower. At first, he thought it was a fisherman or a lost traveler, but the figure never moved. It was there every night, always watching, always silent. The entries stopped abruptly after a particularly chilling passage. "He's getting closer. I don't think I'm alone here anymore. If something happens to me, remember this, he's still here." That night, back at the bed and breakfast, the lighthouse was visible from our window, its dark form silhouetted against the crashing waves. I couldn't stop thinking about Thomas's diary, about the figure he'd described. The wind howled outside, and the waves seemed louder than usual. As I lay awake, staring at the lighthouse in the distance, I noticed something odd. The light, once dead, was now flickering on and off. My breath caught in my throat. There hadn't been a keeper there in decades. Who had lit the lantern? My husband didn't believe me at first, but when the light flickered again, he saw it too. "It's probably just some kids messing around," he said, trying to reassure me. But I wasn't so sure. There was something eerie about the way the light moved, casting long shadows across the cliffs. It felt like a signal, a warning. The more I watched, the more I felt that same creeping dread I'd experienced inside the lighthouse. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We went back to the lighthouse, determined to find out what was happening. The place was as silent as before, but this time, we ventured up the narrow staircase to the lantern room. As we climbed, I felt the air grow colder, the walls closing in around us. My heart pounded in my chest as we reached the top. The lantern room was empty, but the lantern itself was still warm, as though it had been lit recently. Suddenly, we heard it, footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing from below. My blood turned to ice. We were supposed to be the only ones there. We rushed down the stairs, but when we reached the bottom, there was no one. Just the cold wind and the sound of the waves crashing against the shore. But the sense of being watched was overwhelming. The figure Thomas had written about, the one that had been watching him, was still here. That night, the light in the lighthouse flickered again, but this time it didn't stop. It burned steadily, casting its eerie glow over the cliffs. And then, just as the wind picked up, we saw him, a figure standing at the edge of the cliff, staring up at the lighthouse. He was dressed in dark, tattered clothes, his face obscured by shadow. My heart raced as I watched him, frozen in place. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I knew deep down that it was him, the lighthouse keeper. We packed our bags the next morning and left, not daring to stay another night. The woman who ran the bed and breakfast didn't ask why we were leaving early. I think she already knew. As we drove away, the lighthouse disappeared from view, but the memory of that figure on the cliffs stayed with me. I later learned that Thomas wasn't the first keeper to vanish. Over the years, several men had gone missing while tending the lighthouse, all under mysterious circumstances. Even now, I wonder if the lighthouse is still haunted by the figure Thomas wrote about, or if Thomas himself has joined the ranks of those who watch from the cliffs, waiting for someone to discover the truth. And whenever I see a lighthouse on the horizon, I can't help but feel a sense of dread, as though the keeper's secret still lingers in the light. I moved to the small town to take care of my grandmother after her health started to decline. She had always been fiercely independent, but age had finally caught up with her. Her house sat at the edge of town, near Blackwood Cemetery, a place the locals seemed to avoid talking about. The cemetery was old, overgrown, and tucked away behind a dense line of trees. I wasn't too concerned about it at first. After all, it was just a cemetery, right? But soon after moving in, I started hearing the murmurs. At night, when everything else was quiet, I'd hear soft, unintelligible whispers drifting from the direction of the cemetery. They were faint at first, just barely audible over the sound of the wind through the trees. I figured it was my imagination or the creaking of an old house, but the murmurs didn't stop. In fact, they seemed to grow louder with each passing night. Sometimes they sounded almost like crying, other times like people talking just out of earshot. It was unsettling, but I tried to ignore it. One night, as I sat by the window, I noticed something even stranger. The trees that lined the cemetery swayed gently in the breeze, but the air near the graves seemed unnaturally still. It was as though the wind avoided that place. The murmurs were louder that night, and I could have sworn I saw shadows moving between the headstones, even though no one else should have been there. I told myself it was just the trick of the moonlight, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I mentioned the whispers to my grandmother, hoping for some reassurance, but instead, she grew quiet. Her expression darkened, and she warned me not to go near the cemetery. "There are things buried there that should be left alone," she said, her voice shaky. When I pressed her for more, she refused to say anything else. That only made me more curious and more afraid. The next night, the murmurs became impossible to ignore. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of voices, clearer now, as if they were right outside the house. My heart raced as I crept to the window, peering out at the cemetery. The shadows between the headstones seemed to shift and move, and I could almost make out shapes, figures walking among the graves. It felt like the dead were restless, trying to reach out to the living. Determined to find out what was going on, I did some digging into the history of Blackwood Cemetery. What I found was chilling. The cemetery had been the site of a tragic incident nearly a century ago. A group of townspeople had been accused of witchcraft and executed. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves at the far end of the cemetery, and it was said that their spirits had never found peace. Some claimed that their restless souls still haunted the cemetery, whispering their anger and sorrow to anyone who would listen. The more I learned, the worse the whispers became. It was as if the spirits knew I was uncovering their story, and they wanted me to dig deeper. But with each new piece of information, the atmosphere in my grandmother's house grew heavier, darker. My grandmother became more withdrawn, almost as if she knew something she wasn't telling me. She had lived by the cemetery her entire life. Was it possible she had a connection to the tragedy that had occurred there? One stormy night, the whispers grew louder than ever, almost deafening. I could hear them through the walls, the sound of voices blending together in a chaotic hum. It felt like they were inside the house, circling around me. Desperate for answers, I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the cemetery, the rain pouring down as I stumbled through the thick mud. The voices grew clearer with every step I took, guiding me toward the unmarked graves. When I reached the far end of the cemetery, the air was ice cold, and the whispers surrounded me. I shone my flashlight over the graves, and for a moment I thought I saw them. Figures standing among the tombstones, watching me with hollow eyes. My heart raced as the whispers swirled around me, and I could finally make out what they were saying. Help us. I didn't know what to do. The spirits were trapped, their anger and pain echoing through the cemetery, but I wasn't sure how to help them. I rushed back to the house, determined to confront my grandmother. She had to know something. When I finally asked her directly, her face went pale. She admitted that our family had a connection to the tragedy. One of our ancestors had been involved in the trials that led to the wrongful executions. The spirits were angry, and they had been seeking justice ever since. The next morning, I arranged for a proper memorial for the victims, hoping it would give them the peace they deserved. As I stood in the cemetery, watching the stone markers being placed, the air felt lighter, the voices quieter. The shadows that had once moved between the graves were gone, and for the first time since I'd arrived, Blackwood Cemetery felt still. The whispers haven't returned since that day, but I'll never forget the sound of their voices, or the way the cemetery seemed to come alive in the dead of night. The spirits may have found peace, but the memory of what happened there will always haunt me. When my husband and I bought the old Victorian home, we were ecstatic. It was a fixer-upper, sure, but it had character. A sprawling front porch, tall windows, and the kind of craftsmanship you just don't see anymore. The house had been on the market for a while, and we couldn't understand why. It seemed like a perfect project for us to turn into our dream home. We moved in quickly, eager to start renovations, but almost immediately, strange things started happening. It began with noises, soft footsteps echoing through the hallways even when we were alone in the house. At first we chalked it up to the house settling as old houses do, but the footsteps didn't stop. They seemed to follow us, moving from room to room, and there was something distinctly childlike about them. Quick, light, as though small feet were pattering across the wooden floors. My husband and I would exchange uneasy glances, but we tried to ignore it, convinced it was just our imaginations running wild in the empty, echoing rooms. That is, until we found the small, hidden rooms beneath the floorboards. We were renovating the living room when my husband pulled up a section of the floor and found a small door, barely large enough for a child to crawl through. Inside were tiny rooms, hidden away under the house. They were filled with old toys, tattered dolls, and bits of children's clothing. It was like stepping into a forgotten world, one that had been sealed away for decades. My stomach turned as I realized what we had stumbled upon. This house had a dark past, and we were about to uncover it. That night, I heard it for the first time, children's laughter. It was faint, almost as if it were coming from far away, but it was unmistakable. The sound sent a chill down my spine. I checked on my husband, but he was fast asleep. The laughter echoed through the house, bouncing off the walls, and I felt frozen in place, too scared to move. The next morning, I asked him if he had heard anything strange during the night, but he shook his head, brushing it off as a bad dream. The following days grew even stranger. The laughter continued, and sometimes we would hear the sounds of children running through the halls, though there was no one there. One evening, I walked into the kitchen to find all of the chairs stacked neatly on top of the table, though neither of us had done it. Small handprints began to appear on the windows, too high for any child to reach, and at night, I could feel the presence of someone or something watching us. Desperate for answers, I started researching the history of the house. What I found was horrifying. The house had once been an orphanage, run by a cruel headmistress. Several children had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and though investigations were made, no one had ever been charged. The orphanage had been shut down, and the house passed through various owners before it fell into disrepair. I realized then that the children's spirits were still trapped here, their restless souls unable to move on. One night, the activity reached a terrifying peak. We were asleep when I was jolted awake by the sound of heavy footsteps, louder and more deliberate than before. They were coming from beneath the floorboards, and as I listened, I realized they weren't alone. The sound of small, shuffling feet followed, accompanied by the soft murmur of children's voices. My heart raced as I heard a voice, clear as day, whisper, "Help us." Terrified, I woke my husband, and we rushed to the living room, where we had found the hidden rooms. The air was thick with an oppressive, cold energy, and the small door was slightly ajar. I knelt down and peered inside, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. There, in the shadows, were the faint outlines of small figures. Children, their faces pale and expressionless, watching me from the darkness. We knew we couldn't stay in the house any longer. The spirits of the children were still trapped, reliving the horrors they had experienced under the cruel hand of the headmistress. But it wasn't just the children. There was something darker lurking in the house, something that had kept them trapped for all these years. We packed our things and left the next morning, too shaken to stay another night. I contacted a local paranormal investigator, hoping they could help the children find peace. They performed a cleansing ritual, trying to release the spirits from the house. But I still wonder if it worked. Sometimes late at night, I can still hear the faint sound of children's laughter in my dreams, and I wonder if the spirits are still there, waiting for someone else to uncover their hidden rooms beneath the floorboards. It was late, and I was driving down a stretch of highway that seemed to go on forever. The road was empty, just me and the endless black tops stretching ahead, illuminated only by the faint glow of my headlights. I'd taken this route a few times before, a lonely back road cutting through the countryside. But that night something felt different. The air was heavy, the kind of thick silence that makes you feel like the world's holding its breath. I was about halfway home when I saw him, a man standing by the side of the road, his thumb outstretched. It was strange to see someone hitchhiking that far out in the middle of nowhere, but I slowed down anyway. He looked lost, his clothes dirty and torn, like he'd been walking for miles. I rolled down the window and asked if he needed a ride. He didn't say much, just nodded and climbed into the passenger seat. There was something off about him, though. He was quiet, too quiet, and he wouldn't meet my eyes. His face was pale, almost gray, like he hadn't seen the sun in days. We drove in silence for a few miles before he finally spoke. "Where are you headed?" he asked, his voice low and strange, like it hadn't been used in a while. I told him I was heading to the next town and asked where he was going. "Somewhere far," he said. That was all. I tried making small talk, but he wasn't much for conversation. Instead, he started talking about places that didn't exist anymore. Towns and roads that had been gone for decades. The further we drove, the more uneasy I felt. After about 10 minutes, I glanced over at him and noticed something chilling. His clothes. They looked old, out of place, like something someone would have worn 50 years ago. My heart started racing as I realized that his whole presence seemed wrong. The man hadn't looked me in the eye once, and when he did, I saw it. His eyes were empty, hollow. I could feel a cold sweat forming on my skin, but I didn't say anything. I just kept driving, gripping the steering wheel tight. It wasn't until we passed an old abandoned gas station that things got even stranger. The man turned to me and said, "You've been down this road before, haven't you?" His voice sent a shiver down my spine. I nodded slowly, trying to stay calm. "I've been down this road many times," he continued, "but I can never leave." The way he said it, so matter-of-fact, like it wasn't even a big deal. My blood ran cold. That was when I realized this wasn't just some lost hitchhiker. He wasn't alive. The road stretched on, and the night seemed darker than ever. I wanted to pull over, let him out, but I was too scared to stop. The air in the car felt thick, suffocating. The man stared out the window, his face expressionless, as if he wasn't really there. The silence between us was unbearable, the tension growing with every mile. My heart pounded in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Suddenly, without warning, he turned to me again. "You're trapped here too, you know," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "This road, it doesn't lead anywhere anymore. It's a loop. It's been like this for years." My hands tightened on the steering wheel, my knuckles white. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling, but he didn't answer. He just looked ahead, a strange, haunting smile on his face. Panic surged through me as I realized I hadn't seen a single sign of life since picking him up. No other cars, no streetlights, no exits, just an endless stretch of road, like I'd been driving in circles. My GPS wasn't working either, the screen frozen, refusing to update my location. It was as if I was no longer in the real world. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard, but the numbers had stopped changing. Time wasn't moving. I knew I had to get out of there. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt on the side of the road. "You need to get out," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The man didn't move. He just looked at me, his eyes empty and dark. "There's no point," he whispered. "You can't leave. None of us can." My heart was racing now, the fear gripping me tight. I reached over to open the passenger door, but when I turned to look at him again, he was gone. The seat beside me was empty. I sat there for a long moment, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I looked out at the road, but there was no sign of the man. It was as if he had never been there at all. I hit the gas, driving as fast as I could, desperate to get off that highway. But no matter how far I drove, I couldn't find an exit. The road just kept going, stretching endlessly into the night. It wasn't until dawn that I finally found my way back to town. I pulled into a gas station, shaken, and asked the clerk about the highway. His face went pale when I mentioned it. "That road's been closed for years," he said, "ever since the accident." He told me about a crash that had happened decades ago, killing a group of passengers, including a hitchhiker who'd been picked up on that very stretch of road. Ever since, people had reported seeing him, standing by the highway, waiting for another ride. I've never driven down that road again. I don't think I ever will. But sometimes, when I'm driving late at night, I catch a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror, a shadow, a figure standing by the side of the road, and I wonder if the ghost of the old highway is still waiting, searching for someone else to join him. The lake looked perfect. Its calm surface reflected the clear blue sky, and the cabin we rented sat just a few yards from the water's edge, nestled in a grove of pine trees. My friends and I had been looking forward to this weekend all summer. Just a few days of swimming, fishing, and relaxing far from the hustle and bustle of our lives. As we unpacked our bags and settled in, none of us could have imagined the dark secret lurking beneath the lake's serene waters. The first day was uneventful. We swam in the lake, lounged on the dock, and cooked a big dinner over the campfire. But that night, as we sat around the fire talking, something strange happened. A cold breeze swept across the lake, carrying with it a faint whisper. It was too quiet to make out any words, but it sounded like voices, like someone or something was calling to us. We all heard it, but we brushed it off as the wind playing tricks on us. Still, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that settled over the campsite. The next morning, things got stranger. As we prepared to go swimming again, we noticed something odd about the water. It had a slight shimmer, as if something just beneath the surface was moving. My friend Jake was the first to jump in, laughing as he splashed around, but his laughter quickly turned to a scream. He thrashed in the water, struggling to swim back to the dock, yelling that something had grabbed him. We pulled him out, but when we looked, there was nothing there. No fish, no debris, nothing that could have caused what he described. Jake was shaken, but he insisted it must have been a cramp or a tangle of weeds. We tried to enjoy the rest of the day, but the unease hung over us like a cloud. That night, the whispers returned, louder this time. They seemed to come from the lake, growing in intensity as the night went on. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate. It felt as though the lake itself was trying to communicate with us. None of us slept well that night. The next day, we decided to explore the area around the lake. While hiking along the shoreline, we stumbled upon the remains of an old, sunken structure. A few rotting wooden beams barely visible above the waterline. It looked like the remnants of a building, perhaps an old boathouse or dock. But as we stood there, staring out at the water, an overwhelming sense of dread settled over me. Something about this place wasn't right. Later that afternoon, we spoke with a local who ran the small general store in town. When we mentioned the sunken structure, his face went pale. "That's the old town," he said quietly. He explained that decades ago, a small town had stood where the lake now was. It had been flooded to create the reservoir, and the town and its people had been submerged. "They say the spirits of the town never left," he added. "Some folks believe the lake's haunted." Haunted or not, something was definitely wrong with that lake. That night, the whispers turned into full-blown voices, angry, insistent. The lake shimmered under the moonlight, and we could see faint, shadowy figures moving just beneath the surface. As we stood on the dock, staring out at the water, the temperature plummeted, and a thick fog began to rise from the lake. The voices grew louder, clearer, and for the first time we could make out what they were saying. "Let us out." Panic set in. We rushed back to the cabin, locking the doors and windows. But the voices didn't stop. It felt like they were inside the cabin with us, circling around, growing louder with every passing minute. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. In the silence that followed, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, wet, heavy footsteps, as if something had crawled out of the lake and was walking toward the cabin. Jake, who had been the most skeptical of us all, grabbed a flashlight and opened the door, determined to prove there was nothing out there. But as the beam of light swept across the yard, we all saw them. Figures, dripping wet, their faces pale and twisted with anger. They stood at the edge of the lake, staring at us with hollow eyes, as if waiting for something. My heart pounded in my chest, and I knew in that moment that the spirits of the lake's forgotten inhabitants were real. We couldn't stay. We packed our things as quickly as we could, but the voices followed us, echoing through the trees as we raced to the car. As we drove away, I looked back one last time and saw the figures standing on the shore watching us leave. The lake shimmered in the moonlight, its surface calm once again. But I knew the spirits were still there, trapped beneath the water, waiting for someone else to stumble upon their watery graves. Even now, I can still hear the faint whispers of the lake in my nightmares, calling out for release. I don't know what it would take to free them, and frankly, I don't want to find out. All I know is that something was left behind when the town was submerged, and it's still waiting beneath the water, restless and angry. When we moved into the cozy house on Elm Street, it felt like a fresh start. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where kids played in the yard, and everyone waved to each other as they passed. It was exactly what my husband and I were looking for after the chaos of city life. Our new home was perfect, a charming two-story house with a big front porch and a garden I couldn't wait to plant. But soon after settling in, I noticed something odd. The neighbor next door was always watching. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. I'd glance out the window while washing dishes, and there he was, standing at his window, staring directly at our house. His blinds were always half drawn, but his face was just visible enough to make me uncomfortable. I mentioned it to my husband, who laughed it off, saying the man was probably just lonely. But the longer we stayed, the more frequent the watching became. Every time I stepped outside, his eyes followed me from behind the glass. It wasn't just during the day either. Late at night, when I'd get up for a glass of water, I'd see him again, standing in the same spot, his shadowy figure barely illuminated by the dim light in his house. I never saw him leave, never saw him step outside. He was always just there, watching. The thought of confronting him crossed my mind, but something about his presence made my skin crawl. I decided it was best to ignore him and focus on our new life. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. In fact, it grew worse. I'd be sitting in the living room, reading, and suddenly feel a chill down my spine, as if someone were standing behind me. When I'd turn around, there was no one there, but the sensation lingered. Lights in the house began to flicker, and sometimes I'd hear soft tapping on the windows, though there was never anyone outside. I tried to brush it off, but a creeping dread started to settle in the back of my mind. One night, I woke up to the sound of our front door creaking open. My heart leapt into my throat as I nudged my husband awake. We grabbed a flashlight and crept downstairs, but the door was locked, just as we had left it. The windows were shut, and there was no sign of anyone having been inside. But the unsettling part? The lights in the neighbor's house were off for the first time since we'd moved in. His window, always illuminated by that dim light, was pitch black. The next day, I asked some of the other neighbors about the man. They looked at me with confusion. "You must be mistaken," one of them said. "No one's lived in that house for years. It's been empty since Mr. Roberts passed away." My blood ran cold. I had seen him every day, standing at the window, watching us. But if no one lived there, then who was it? I didn't know what to think. I rushed back home, my mind racing, but as I approached the house, I saw it again, his face staring out from behind the window. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house felt too still, too quiet. Every creak and groan made my heart race. Around midnight, I heard the tapping again, soft, rhythmic knocks at the window, like someone was trying to get my attention. My husband didn't hear it, fast asleep beside me, so I went downstairs alone. I slowly pulled back the curtain, expecting to see the man standing there, but the yard was empty. However, when I turned away, I felt the unmistakable sensation of eyes on me. The days that followed grew more intense. Every night, the tapping returned, always at the same time, and always followed by that overwhelming sense of being watched. One evening, while we were having dinner, the lights flickered again. This time, the power went out completely. We sat in the darkness for what felt like hours, and then, out of nowhere, the faint sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. We were alone in the house, or so I thought. Determined to figure out what was happening, I did some digging into the history of the house next door. What I found was disturbing. Mr. Roberts, the man who had once lived there, had been a recluse in his final years. After his wife died, he never left the house, spending his days staring out the window, watching the neighborhood. Some said he had gone mad, others believed he was waiting for something, or someone. He died in that house, alone, and it had remained empty ever since. It wasn't long before I started seeing him everywhere, not just at the window, but in reflections, in the shadows cast on the walls. The presence followed me through the house, lingering behind me like a cold breath on my neck. The taps on the windows grew louder, more insistent, and one night I swore I heard a voice whisper my name. My husband couldn't hear it, but I knew it was real. The watcher wasn't just a ghost haunting the house next door. He was inside our home now. In a desperate attempt to end the haunting, we contacted a paranormal investigator. He told us that the watcher had latched onto us, drawn by our presence in the neighborhood. His spirit, restless and angry, had never left the house. The investigator performed a cleansing ritual, but even as he did, I could feel those eyes watching from the shadows, waiting. We moved out shortly after, unable to shake the feeling that the watcher was still with us. I still have nightmares about those nights on Elm Street, the tapping on the windows, the cold gaze following me wherever I went. I haven't returned to that house, and I never plan to. But sometimes, when I pass by a window at night, I catch a glimpse of something, a shadow, a face, and I wonder if the watcher has found someone else to haunt. When we moved to Hawthorne Avenue, it seemed like the perfect neighborhood. The houses were immaculate, with neatly trimmed lawns, and the streets were always quiet. Almost too quiet. I remember thinking it was strange that, despite how many homes there were, I rarely saw anyone outside. No kids playing, no neighbors chatting on their porches. At first, I didn't mind. After all, we had moved there for peace and quiet. But the silence began to feel unnatural. It wasn't long before I started noticing other odd things about the neighborhood. Every house had its curtains drawn, and at night, the lights were always dim. My husband and I joked that maybe everyone was just shy, but the more time we spent there, the more unsettling it became. I tried introducing myself to a few neighbors, knocking on doors, but no one ever answered. It was as if the entire street was avoiding us. One evening, I saw something that made my skin crawl. As I was pulling into our driveway, I noticed a figure standing by the window in the house next door. The blinds were partially open, and I could just make out a face staring directly at me. I waved, but the person didn't move, didn't react. Just stood there, watching. When I told my husband, he shrugged it off, saying the neighbors were probably just private people. But something about that motionless figure stuck with me. Then one night, the whispers started. I was up late, reading in bed, when I heard faint murmurs coming from outside. At first I thought it was just the wind, but the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They were coming from the yard. I looked out the window and saw shadows moving between the houses, darting in and out of view. My heart raced as I strained to listen. The words were impossible to understand, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, hushed, like someone was sharing a secret. The next morning, I found a note in our mailbox. It wasn't signed, but the message was clear. Don't ask questions. Don't try to leave. My stomach churned as I reread the words, trying to make sense of them. What did it mean? Don't try to leave. I showed the note to my husband, who dismissed it as a prank. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. I decided to ignore the warning, until the next night. At around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of tapping on the window. I shot out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest. My husband was still asleep, completely unaware. I crept to the window and pulled back the curtain. Standing in our yard were 3 figures, their faces obscured by the shadows. They were staring at the house, unmoving, as if they were waiting for something. My blood ran cold. I stepped back from the window, my breath quickening, but when I looked again, they were gone. The following day, I tried calling the local police to report the strange figures, but the call wouldn't go through. It was as if the line had been disconnected. When I tried to use my cell phone, I noticed I had no signal, which was strange since we'd never had any problems before. I felt trapped, cut off from the world outside of Hawthorne Avenue. The silence of the neighborhood now felt suffocating, like it was closing in around us. That evening, I saw another note in the mailbox. This time, it was more direct. You've been warned. Don't ignore it. Fear crept through me as I realized that we weren't just dealing with strange, quiet neighbors. Something far darker was at play. My husband and I decided we needed to leave, to pack our things and get out as soon as possible. But as we prepared to leave that night, something horrifying happened. The lights in the house flickered and then went out completely. The power was gone, plunging the house into darkness. From outside, I heard movement, footsteps on the porch, whispers just outside the door. We huddled together, trying to stay quiet, but the whispers grew louder, the voices now directly outside our window. Someone or something was surrounding the house. My husband grabbed a flashlight and peered out the window. His face went pale. "They're everywhere," he whispered. We didn't wait. We grabbed what we could and ran for the car. But as we opened the front door, we saw them. The neighbors, standing in their yards, completely still, watching us. Their faces were blank, emotionless, and their eyes followed us as we ran to the car. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the keys, but finally the engine roared to life. We sped down the street, past the silent, staring figures, and didn't stop until we were miles away from Hawthorne Avenue. We've never returned, and I don't think we ever will. I still don't know what was happening in that neighborhood, or why the people there were so strange. But I do know one thing: whatever it was, it didn't want us to leave. Sometimes late at night, I think I hear those whispers again, like they're calling us back. But we'll never go back. Not after what we saw. One afternoon, while I was digging near the well, my shovel struck something hard. I knelt down and brushed away the dirt to reveal bones, old, brittle, and scattered just beneath the surface. My heart raced as I realized what we had uncovered. These weren't animal bones, they were human. I called my husband over, and we unearthed more, all around the well. It was a graveyard, hidden beneath the flowers and vines, forgotten for who knows how long. As we stood there, the air grew thick with the same foul smell that had plagued us since we uncovered the well. The cries returned, louder than ever, as though the voices were right there with us, begging to be freed. My husband and I hurried inside, locking the doors and windows, but the noise didn't stop. It surrounded the house, growing more insistent with every passing minute. The well wasn't just a part of the garden. It was a prison, and whatever had been trapped there for so long was trying to escape. That night, as we lay in bed, the house trembled. It was subtle at first, a low rumble that seemed to come from deep within the earth. The voices were louder now, almost deafening, and the stench of rot filled the air. I knew we had disturbed something ancient, something dark. We needed to leave, but the garden, once so inviting, felt like a trap, the well at its center pulling us deeper into its nightmare. We tried contacting local authorities, hoping they could help us with the bones we had found, but no one seemed interested. It was as if the town had forgotten about the house, about the well, just as its previous owners had. We were alone, and whatever was beneath the earth knew it. That night, I woke to the sound of footsteps on the porch. I thought it was my husband, but when I reached out, he was still in bed. I listened, heart pounding, as the footsteps moved through the house, slow and deliberate, heading toward the back door where the garden lay. I didn't dare move. I lay frozen in bed, listening as the footsteps reached the door and stopped. There was a long silence, followed by the creak of the door opening. Then, the voices returned, louder than ever, filling the house with their cries. The temperature plummeted, and the smell of decay was overwhelming. My husband woke, gasping for air, as we both realized the voices were inside now, surrounding us, pulling us toward the well. We left the next morning, not bothering to pack more than the essentials. I couldn't bring myself to go near the garden again, and I knew, deep down, that whatever was in the well was never meant to be disturbed. As we drove away, I glanced back at the house, half expecting to see the figures from my nightmares standing by the well, watching us leave. The house sits empty now, the garden slowly reclaiming it. I've heard that the new owners have plans to restore the garden, but I know what lies beneath the flowers and vines. I only hope they never uncover the well. When I first inherited the antique mirror from my late aunt, I thought it was a beautiful, albeit slightly eerie, addition to our home. Its ornate gold frame and the clouded glass gave it a vintage charm that fit perfectly in our hallway. My aunt had always been fascinated with old objects, and the mirror was one of her favorites, though she never spoke much about where it came from. I hung it without a second thought, not realizing how much that decision would come to haunt me. It didn't take long before I noticed something strange about the mirror. The first time it happened, I was passing by, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw my reflection smile. Except, I hadn't smiled. I stopped, stared into the glass, and waited for it to happen again, but my reflection stayed still, mirroring my confused expression perfectly. I laughed it off, telling myself I was just tired, but deep down, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something was wrong. Over the next few days, small, inexplicable things started happening. I'd walk by the mirror and catch glimpses of movement, my reflection turning its head a second too late, its eyes not quite meeting mine. It was subtle, easy to dismiss if I hadn't been paying attention, but it kept happening. The worst part was that the more I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, the more frequent the strange occurrences became. My reflection didn't always follow me exactly. It seemed to have a mind of its own. One evening, while brushing my hair in front of the mirror, I noticed something chilling. My reflection was brushing its hair just like me, but when I set the brush down, it continued the motion for a few moments longer, as if it hadn't noticed I'd stopped. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly turned away, feeling a cold sweat trickle down my spine. When I looked back, everything seemed normal again, but the damage was done. I knew something was terribly off. I began avoiding the mirror altogether, too unnerved to spend much time in front of it. But avoiding it wasn't enough. Soon, I started seeing my reflection in other mirrors around the house, even when I wasn't standing in front of them. I'd catch a glimpse of myself in the bathroom mirror while I was still in the hallway, or see my face staring back at me from the reflection in a window when I hadn't even approached it. It was as if my reflection had become detached, lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to notice it. I finally knew what I had to do. That night, while my husband was asleep, I took the mirror out to the backyard. The moonlight cast long shadows across the grass as I stood there, gripping the mirror tightly, staring into the twisted reflection that had haunted me for weeks. My reflection's smile widened, its eyes glinting with malice. With a deep breath, I smashed the mirror against the ground, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. The sound echoed in the still night air, and for a moment, I felt a wave of relief. But as I turned to walk back inside, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. In the shards of broken glass scattered across the ground, my reflection was still there, dozens of tiny versions of myself, staring up at me with that same malevolent smile. I realized, with a sinking feeling, that breaking the mirror hadn't freed me. It had only multiplied the nightmare. I was thrilled when I got the call to photograph Ashbury House. It was a photographer's dream, an abandoned mansion with a tragic past, left untouched for decades. The place was said to be haunted, but I didn't believe in ghosts. To me, it was just another job, a chance to capture eerie beauty and decaying grandeur. The day I arrived, the house loomed large and imposing, its once stately walls now overrun with ivy and neglect. The moment I stepped inside, the air was thick with dust and silence, as if the place had been waiting for me. The house was just as magnificent as I had imagined, though there was something unsettling about it. The grand foyer was covered in a layer of grime, and broken chandeliers hung like skeletal remains from the ceiling. The rooms were filled with decaying furniture, old portraits, and the remnants of a life long abandoned. I spent hours photographing every inch, marveling at the way the light filtered through the broken windows, casting long shadows across the floor. It was perfect. Too perfect, in fact. As I moved through the house, I had the strange feeling that I wasn't alone. It started when I was in the drawing room. As I focused my camera on an old dusty mirror, I saw something move in the reflection. A figure, just a flicker, gone as quickly as it appeared. I lowered the camera and looked around, but the room was empty. I chalked it up to the lighting, a trick of the eye. But as I continued photographing, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then I'd catch a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, shadows, movement, but when I turned, there was nothing there. That night, back at home, I developed the photos. As the images came to life, I noticed something strange. In several of the pictures, there were faces, faint, ghostly faces, peering from the background. I hadn't seen anyone in the house while I was shooting, and these figures were out of place, as if they didn't belong. Their expressions were blank, their eyes dark and hollow. My heart skipped a beat as I flipped through the photos, each one more unsettling than the last. The figures weren't just in one or two shots. They were in nearly every frame, always in the background, always watching. At first, I thought it must be a flaw in the film or a lighting issue, but as I looked closer, I realized the faces were too detailed, too distinct. There was something chilling about the way they looked directly at the camera, as if they knew they were being photographed. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. Those figures weren't there when I took the photos, but now they were all I could see. Over the next few days, the strangeness followed me. The photos seemed to come alive at night. I would wake to the sound of knocking, soft at first, but growing louder, always near the room where I had stored the prints. When I went to check, the room would be empty, but the photos seemed to have shifted, as if the figures had moved within the frames. One night, I noticed that the faces, once distant and blurred, now appeared closer, their eyes locked onto mine. The knocking continued, growing more insistent. It was as if the figures in the photos were trying to get out, trying to reach me. I started having nightmares, dreams where I was back in Ashbury House, wandering its endless halls, the figures from the photos following me, their eyes glowing in the dark. In the dreams, I couldn't escape them. No matter how fast I ran, they were always right behind me, whispering my name in voices that sent chills down my spine. One night, I woke to the sound of footsteps in my apartment. At first, I thought I was still dreaming, but as I lay there, I realized the sound was real. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving through the dark. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the sound. The apartment was empty, but the door to the room where I kept the photos was ajar. Inside, the photos had fallen to the floor, scattered across the room. In each image, the figures were no longer in the background. They were front and center, their faces twisted with anger, their eyes glaring at me. That was when I knew I had to go back to Ashbury House. Whatever I had captured in those photos, it was angry, and it wasn't going to leave me alone until I returned. The house felt different this time, colder, more oppressive. As I walked through the rooms, the air grew heavy, and I could feel the weight of the house pressing down on me. The figures from the photos were everywhere, in the corners of the rooms, in the broken mirrors, in the shadows cast by the dim light. They were waiting for me. I reached the drawing room where I had first seen the figure in the mirror. My hands trembled as I set the photos down on the floor, as if returning them to the place where they belonged. For a moment, the house was still, silent. And then the temperature plummeted. I could hear the faint sound of whispers, voices rising from the walls, from the floors, from the very air around me. The figures emerged from the shadows, their eyes locked on mine, their expressions filled with fury. I don't remember much after that. The next thing I knew, I was outside, standing in front of the house, gasping for breath. I left the photos inside, hoping that by abandoning them there, I could rid myself of the haunting. I haven't been back since, and I don't plan to. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the knocking on my walls, and I wonder if one day, the figures from Ashbury House will find their way back to me. Taking a job as the night watchman at an old cemetery wasn't my first choice, but I needed the money, and the work seemed easy enough. Blackstone Cemetery was quiet. Too quiet, really. It was far from town, surrounded by thick woods, and had long been abandoned by most of the living. The cemetery hadn't seen a new burial in decades, and aside from the occasional mourner or curious kid, it was mostly forgotten. That suited me just fine. I liked the peace and solitude that came with the job. At least, at first. The first few nights were uneventful. I'd do my rounds, walking between the crumbling headstones, listening to the wind rustling through the trees. The cemetery was eerie, sure, but nothing out of the ordinary for an old place like that. It wasn't until my third or fourth night that I started noticing the graves. New ones. Freshly dug. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. After all, no one had been buried here for years. But as I made my way through the cemetery, I saw more. Rows of freshly turned earth, as though someone had been burying bodies in secret. I went to the cemetery's records the next day, but there were no new burials listed. I called my supervisor, but he laughed it off, saying it was probably just animals, or the ground settling. Still, it didn't sit right with me. The graves were too neat, too precise to be anything natural. They had names on the headstones too, names I recognized, names of people who were still very much alive. The next night, I went back to the fresh graves, my flashlight casting long, eerie shadows across the tombstones. My breath hitched when I saw it, a grave with my own name on it. My heart raced as I stood there, staring at the headstone with my name carved in cold, unforgiving stone. The date of death was today. It had to be some kind of sick joke, I thought. Maybe some local kids messing around, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. As I turned to leave, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate, and heavy. I spun around, shining my light toward the sound, but no one was there. The air grew colder, and a thick fog began to creep in from the edges of the cemetery, swirling around the graves. The wind picked up, carrying with it a faint whisper, almost like a voice calling my name. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, but deep down, I knew better. The next few nights were worse. More graves appeared, each one freshly dug, each with a name I recognized. Friends, acquaintances, even strangers I had passed on the street. The fog returned every night, thicker and colder, and the whispers grew louder, filling the air with a sinister, almost mocking tone. Every time I passed the grave with my name on it, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was as if the cemetery was preparing for something dark. One night, as I made my rounds, the fog was so thick I could barely see in front of me. I heard footsteps again, this time closer, heavier. The ground beneath my feet felt like it was shifting, and I realized with a sickening jolt that the graves were moving. The dirt was stirring, and something was trying to claw its way out. My heart pounded in my chest as I shone my flashlight around, but it was no use. The fog swallowed the light, and the footsteps grew louder. Then, I saw him. The cemetery's keeper, or what was left of him. He was standing at the far edge of the cemetery, watching me with hollow, sunken eyes. His clothes were tattered, covered in dirt, as if he had just crawled out of one of the graves himself. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his lips twisted into a cruel, knowing smile. My legs felt like they were glued to the ground. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. He didn't say a word, but I could feel his presence, ancient, malevolent, and hungry. I don't remember running, but somehow I made it back to the small office by the cemetery gates. I slammed the door behind me, locking it, as if that could keep whatever was out there from getting in. The whispers outside grew louder, more insistent. I could hear the sound of earth being turned, the soft, wet thud of something being pulled from the ground, and then a knock on the door, slow, deliberate. It was the cemetery's keeper. He had come for me. I didn't stay to find out what he wanted. I bolted out the back door, running as fast as I could, not daring to look back. I left everything behind, my flashlight, my jacket, even my car. I just ran until I reached the edge of town, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my ears. I never went back to Blackstone Cemetery. I don't know if they ever found my replacement, but something tells me they didn't. Sometimes late at night I still hear the whispers. They drift through the darkness, soft and chilling, like the wind through the trees. And every so often I'll see a name in the obituary, someone I knew, someone who had appeared on one of those fresh graves. I don't know what the cemetery's keeper wanted that night, but I do know this. Once the cemetery marks you, it doesn't forget. We thought renting the house for the summer would be a fun escape. A group of us, college friends who hadn't seen each other in a while, decided it would be the perfect place for a relaxing vacation. The house was old but charming, perched on the edge of a dense forest, with large windows that looked out over the mountains. It had that classic rustic appeal: creaky wooden floors, overstuffed furniture, and an eerie stillness when the wind wasn't howling through the trees. It felt like a place that had stories to tell, though none of us were prepared for the one it had waiting for us. The first few days were great. We spent time hiking, swimming in the nearby lake, and sitting around the fire pit late into the night, reminiscing about old times. But the house had a way of getting into your head. It started slowly. Odd noises, like whispers just beyond the edge of hearing, and a sense that we were being watched. At first we laughed it off. Every old house has its quirks, right? But things began to change, and the longer we stayed, the more it felt like the house was coming alive. It was little things at first. I'd leave a room, come back, and find my belongings moved. Nothing major, just a book shifted from the table to the floor, or a chair slightly out of place. No one else seemed to notice, but it started to unsettle me. Then, one morning, I found a drawing on the wall that hadn't been there the night before. A rough, childlike sketch of a house. I assumed it was a prank, maybe one of my friends messing with me, but no one admitted to doing it. That was when I started feeling like the house was playing a game with us. Soon, we all began having vivid, disturbing dreams. In mine, I was a child again, wandering through a maze of corridors that didn't exist in the house. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't find my way out. In the distance, I could hear my mother calling me, but her voice was faint, like it was coming from behind a wall. When I woke up, the house felt different, colder, like it was watching me. The others had similar experiences, each dream dredging up something personal, something buried deep in our pasts. One night, we were sitting around the fireplace when my friend Sarah suddenly went quiet, staring into the flames. After a long silence, she said, "Do you ever feel like this place knows more about us than we do?" We all laughed it off at first, but her words stuck with me. The house wasn't just playing tricks on us. It seemed to be digging into our minds, pulling out memories we'd long forgotten. It wasn't long before those memories began manifesting in terrifying ways. The next day, I found an old toy, a stuffed bear, that I hadn't seen since I was 5 years old, sitting on my bed. My heart nearly stopped. I knew it was the same bear, the one I had lost decades ago. I confronted my friends, but they all swore they hadn't put it there. That night, Sarah found an old journal she'd kept as a child, pages filled with her handwriting, but the book had never left her parents' attic. One by one, we all found pieces of our past scattered throughout the house, as though it was slowly pulling us apart, showing us the things we thought we'd escaped. As the days passed, the atmosphere grew heavier. The house seemed to shift, the walls closing in around us. Doors that had once led to familiar rooms now opened to unfamiliar hallways, and mirrors showed reflections of places we'd never been. We began hearing voices, soft at first, but then louder, more insistent. They were voices from our childhoods, but they didn't sound right. They echoed through the house at night, calling us by name, urging us to remember things we'd rather forget. One night, my friend Jake woke us all up, yelling that he had seen something in his room. We rushed to his side, but by the time we got there, he was pale and shaking, pointing at the wall. There, scratched into the wood, were words that none of us had put there. "You can't leave." The scratches were fresh, the wood splintered, as though someone, or something, had clawed them into the wall. We decided right then and there that we needed to leave the house, but it wasn't that simple. When we tried to leave the next morning, the front door wouldn't open. Neither would the windows. The house, it seemed, had decided we weren't going anywhere. Panic set in, and we spent the day trying to find another way out. But the more we searched, the more the house seemed to twist and turn, like it was rearranging itself to keep us inside. Every time we thought we'd found a way out, we ended up right back where we started. The house was toying with us, and it wasn't finished yet. That night, the voices returned, louder than ever. They weren't just calling to us, they were inside the house, moving through the walls, the floors, the very air. Shadows flickered in the corners of the rooms, taking on shapes that weren't quite human. I could feel the house closing in around us, suffocating us with its presence. It wanted something from us, our memories, our fears, maybe even our souls. In the end, we found the way out by accident. Sarah stumbled upon a hidden door in the basement, a door that hadn't been there before. It led to a tunnel beneath the house, cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of earth and decay. We didn't ask questions, we just ran. The tunnel twisted and turned, but eventually we found ourselves outside, gasping for breath in the cool night air. The house loomed behind us, dark and silent, as though it had let us go. We never talked about what happened that summer. We all went our separate ways, trying to forget the house and the things it had shown us. But I still dream about it sometimes. The house that remembers. And every time I close my eyes, I can feel it watching, waiting for the day it can pull me back inside. The grandfather clock had been sitting in the corner of the estate sale, forgotten and covered in dust. Its tall, wooden frame was intricately carved, and though the wood was chipped and faded, there was something about it that caught my eye. The seller told me it had belonged to a wealthy family who'd lived in the old mansion up on the hill. The clock hadn't worked for years, but I didn't care. I loved the look of it and thought it would make a great centerpiece in my living room. I never imagined the trouble it would bring into my life. Once home, I cleaned the clock and tried winding it, but it refused to work. No matter how many times I set the hands, they always stopped at midnight. I figured it was just old, maybe broken beyond repair, and left it as a decorative piece. It wasn't until that night that things started to get strange. As I lay in bed, I heard the faintest ticking sound. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but when I got up to check, I found the clock's hands moving, slowly, steadily toward midnight. I stood there, frozen, as the clock struck 12. The chimes echoed through the house, each one louder than the last. When the final chime rang out, the temperature in the room plummeted. A cold breeze swept through the house, even though all the windows were closed. It sent a chill down my spine. The room seemed darker, the shadows longer, as if something was lurking just beyond the light. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the old house creaking in the night. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Over the next few days, the clock continued its strange behavior. Every night, at exactly midnight, it would chime, and each time it did, something eerie would happen. The lights in the house would flicker, cold spots would appear, and I would hear distant whispers, soft at first, but growing louder as the clock struck its final chime. The ticking sound followed me through the house, even when I was nowhere near the clock. It was as if the clock was alive, watching me, waiting for something. One night, after the clock chimed midnight, I woke to find my bedroom door wide open. I distinctly remembered closing it before bed, but there it was, swinging slowly on its hinges. The whispers were louder now, filling the hallway outside my room. My heart raced as I stepped into the hallway, flashlight in hand. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. I knew something was in the house with me, something connected to that cursed clock. Determined to figure out what was going on, I did some research on the mansion where the clock had come from. What I found was disturbing. The clock had once belonged to a man named Henry Blackwood, a notorious criminal who had been involved in a series of gruesome murders in the late 1800s. According to legend, Blackwood had used the clock to keep track of his victims, each chime at midnight marking the moment of their death. It was said that he had trapped their souls inside the clock, binding them to it for eternity. The more I learned, the worse the activity in the house became. The clock's chimes grew louder, more menacing, and the cold spots followed me wherever I went. I began having nightmares, visions of the victims, their pale, lifeless faces staring at me, their hands reaching out as if begging for help. In the dreams, I was trapped inside the clock, the walls closing in around me, the sound of the ticking growing louder and louder until it was all I could hear. One night, after a particularly intense nightmare, I decided I'd had enough. I was going to get rid of the clock. I grabbed a hammer and made my way to the living room, determined to smash it to pieces. But when I approached the clock, something stopped me. The air around it felt thick, heavy, as though the clock was daring me to try. My hands trembled as I raised the hammer, but before I could swing, the clock struck midnight. The chimes were deafening. The lights in the house flickered wildly, and the whispers turned into screams, loud, anguished cries that echoed through the room. The temperature dropped to near freezing, and I felt a presence in the room with me, something dark and malevolent. I dropped the hammer, backing away in terror as the clock continued to chime, its hands moving faster and faster. The room seemed to warp around me, the walls closing in, the shadows growing darker. Suddenly, the chimes stopped, and the house fell into an eerie silence. I stood there, my breath visible in the cold air, waiting for something, anything to happen, but nothing did. The clock's hands had stopped moving, frozen once again at midnight. I knew then that smashing the clock wouldn't solve anything. Whatever curse was attached to it, whatever spirits were trapped inside, destroying it would only make things worse. The next day, I contacted a local paranormal investigator, desperate for help. He came to the house, his face grim as he examined the clock. "This isn't just any haunted object," he said. "The souls trapped inside are restless, and they're tied to this clock for a reason. If you destroy it, they may be unleashed, free to roam, but still bound to you." The only way to break the curse, he explained, was to return the clock to its original resting place, Blackwood's mansion. That night, I loaded the clock into my car and drove to the abandoned mansion on the hill. The air around the house felt heavy, as though the ground itself was weighed down by the horrors of the past. I carried the clock inside, my heart pounding, as I made my way to the room where it had once stood. As I set it down, the ticking stopped. The house fell silent, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of relief. I left the mansion and never looked back. The house, the clock, and the souls trapped within it are all part of the past now. But every so often, late at night, I still hear the faint sound of a clock ticking, and I wonder if I've truly escaped its curse. It started with a single light. I had just moved back to Crestfield, a quiet little town tucked away in the mountains, when people began talking about strange lights appearing over the woods at night. At first, it was nothing more than a curiosity, something for the locals to gossip about. No one could explain it. The lights were faint, barely visible, but they hung in the sky like distant stars, glowing a pale blue. I remember standing on my porch one evening, watching the lights flicker over the treetops, thinking how odd they looked, almost otherworldly. As the days passed, the lights became brighter, more intense, and they didn't go unnoticed for long. Kids from town began sneaking into the woods, trying to find the source of the glow. Some came back with wild stories about eerie sounds and shadows moving just beyond the trees. But others, well, they didn't come back at all. Search parties were sent out, but no one found anything. It was like the missing people had vanished into thin air, swallowed by the woods without a trace. The town began to buzz with rumors. Some said it was aliens. Others whispered about government experiments. My friends and I couldn't resist the mystery. We were young, reckless, and convinced we could solve what others couldn't. One night, we decided to venture into the woods ourselves, determined to find out what was happening. The sky was clear, the air crisp, and the lights were brighter than ever, dancing just above the tree line. There were 5 of us, me, Jake, Sarah, Will, and Emily, and as we trekked deeper into the forest, the usual sounds of nature faded away. The only noise was the crunch of leaves beneath our feet and the low hum of the lights overhead. The deeper we went, the stranger the woods became. The trees seemed taller, their branches twisted into unnatural shapes, and the ground felt soft, almost spongy, like it was pulsing beneath our feet. The lights grew brighter, but the closer we got, the more disoriented we became. It was as if the forest itself was trying to confuse us, leading us in circles. Every path looked the same, every tree identical, but the lights, they kept moving, guiding us deeper. After what felt like hours, we stumbled upon a clearing. At the center, the lights hovered low, almost within reach. They pulsated, casting a soft glow across the clearing, illuminating the ground beneath. At first, we were mesmerized by their beauty, but then we noticed the ground, fresh mounds of earth scattered around the clearing, like shallow graves. My stomach churned as a cold realization hit me. These weren't just lights, they were something else, something alive. Sarah stepped forward, drawn to the lights like a moth to a flame. Before we could stop her, she reached out, her fingers grazing the edge of the glow. In an instant, the light flared, blinding us. I heard Sarah scream, a sound that still haunts me. When the light dimmed again, she was gone. There was no trace of her, no footprints, no struggle, just empty air where she had stood. Panic set in. We searched the clearing, calling her name, but it was useless. The woods had taken her, just like the others. We ran. There was no other option. But the woods wouldn't let us go so easily. The lights followed us, darting between the trees, faster now, more aggressive. The hum turned into a low vibrating buzz that rattled through my skull. Every direction we turned led us back to the clearing, back to the lights. It was like we were trapped in some kind of twisted loop, the forest folding in on itself, refusing to let us leave. Will was the next to disappear. One moment he was right behind me, the next he was gone. I didn't hear a scream, didn't see any light flare, he just vanished. The panic in Emily's eyes mirrored my own. Jake tried to keep us calm, but I could see the terror creeping into his voice. We had to get out. But no matter how fast we ran, no matter how far we thought we had gone, we always ended up back at that cursed clearing. I don't know how long we wandered before Jake and Emily vanished too. One second, they were running beside me, and the next, I was alone. The lights were everywhere now, flickering in and out of existence, shifting between the trees like they were playing some kind of sick game. The buzzing in my head grew louder, almost unbearable, and I felt my legs weaken. I collapsed to the ground, staring up at the lights as they circled above me. In that moment, I understood. The lights weren't from this world. They were something older, something far more powerful than we could ever comprehend. They had been here long before us, hiding in the woods, waiting for people like us, people curious enough to seek them out. And once they found us, they wouldn't let us go. I don't know why they spared me. Maybe it was luck, maybe they just weren't finished with me yet. But somehow, I managed to crawl my way out of those woods, dazed and broken. I was the only one who made it back. The search parties looked for weeks, but they never found any trace of Sarah, Jake, Will, or Emily. No one believed me when I told them about the lights, about the things I had seen. I've spent years trying to forget, trying to convince myself it was all a nightmare. But every now and then, on a clear night, I still see the lights flickering over the trees in the distance, calling me back. When we bought the house in the old town of Crestwood, we thought we were getting a bargain. The place was historic, charming in its way, with creaky wooden floors and thick stone walls that had weathered centuries. The previous owners hadn't lived there for years, so the house had fallen into a bit of disrepair, but we were eager to fix it up. As we started renovations, we discovered a hidden door in the basement. A door we hadn't noticed before, tucked away behind a pile of old boxes. It was small and made of heavy oak, and when we pried it open, we found a narrow staircase leading down into the earth. At first we thought it might just be an old storage cellar, but as we descended, we realized it was something much bigger. The stairs seemed to go on forever, and the air grew colder the deeper we went. At the bottom, we found ourselves in a tunnel. It stretched out in both directions, disappearing into the darkness. The walls were lined with damp, crumbling bricks, and the floor was uneven, with puddles of stagnant water reflecting our flashlight beams. We were intrigued. Old towns like Crestwood were full of secrets. Underground tunnels used during Prohibition, escape routes from wars long past. It seemed like we had stumbled onto one of those hidden parts of history. My husband and I decided to explore further, thinking we might find some forgotten relics. But the deeper we went, the more unsettling the tunnel became. The walls seemed to close in around us, and there was a strange, damp smell in the air that reminded me of decaying wood. As we walked, we noticed symbols carved into the bricks, strange, ancient-looking symbols that neither of us recognized. Some looked like runes. Others were shapes that didn't seem to belong to any known language. They were faded with age, but they covered the walls in places, running along the length of the tunnel like some forgotten script. I tried to brush it off, telling myself they were just old graffiti, but they made my skin crawl. Eventually, we came to a chamber, an open area where the tunnel widened into a larger space. In the center of the room was a stone altar, worn smooth with age. Around it, on the floor, were more symbols, arranged in a circle. My heart began to race as I realized this wasn't just an ordinary tunnel. This chamber had been used for something dark. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, and for the first time I felt a strong urge to turn back. But my husband insisted we keep going. As we explored the chamber, we heard something. At first, it was faint, like the sound of wind rushing through the tunnels, but it grew louder the longer we stood there. It was a low, rumbling noise, almost like a chant, echoing through the walls. My husband thought it was just the sound of the old tunnel settling, but I wasn't so sure. There was something too deliberate about it, like voices murmuring in the distance, too far away to make out the words, but close enough to feel the vibration in the air. Suddenly our flashlights flickered and went out. We were plunged into complete darkness. I felt panic rise in my chest as the chanting grew louder, more insistent. I grabbed my husband's arm, and we fumbled for the flashlights, but they wouldn't turn back on. It was as if something in the tunnel was draining the power from them. We were completely blind, with only the sound of the growing chant surrounding us. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in on us from all sides. Then, just as suddenly as the lights had gone out, the chanting stopped. The silence was deafening. For a moment, I thought I could hear breathing, soft, steady breathing that wasn't ours coming from the shadows. I wanted to run, but my legs felt frozen to the spot. Then, without warning, a cold hand brushed my arm. I gasped and spun around, but there was no one there. My husband grabbed my hand and we bolted, running back the way we had come, the darkness swallowing us whole. We ran for what felt like hours, stumbling through the pitch-black tunnel, our footsteps echoing off the stone walls. I was certain we would never find our way back, that the tunnel would trap us there forever. But eventually, we found the staircase and climbed up, gasping for breath. We slammed the door behind us and locked it, as if that could somehow keep whatever was in the tunnel from following us. Back upstairs, we tried to convince ourselves it was just an old, forgotten part of the town's history. But neither of us could shake the feeling that something was down there, something ancient and angry, something that didn't want us to leave. We decided to seal the door and never speak of it again. We even considered selling the house and moving somewhere far away, but part of me feared that whatever was in that tunnel wouldn't let us go so easily. Over the next few weeks, strange things began happening in the house. At night, we'd hear faint whispers, like the sound of the chant we'd heard in the tunnel. Objects would move on their own, small things like books shifting on the shelves or chairs scraping across the floor. But the worst was the scratching. Late at night, we'd hear it coming from beneath the floorboards, like something was trying to claw its way up from the tunnel. One night, we woke to find the basement door wide open, the lock broken. My heart sank as I realized what it meant. Whatever we had disturbed in that tunnel was no longer content to stay below. It had found a way into the house, and now it was only a matter of time before it came for us. I hadn't been back to Crestview Lake in years, not since my brother disappeared. Growing up, we spent every summer there, our parents renting the same lakeside cabin year after year. But that last summer, when my brother vanished without a trace, it changed everything. The lake had been our haven, our escape, but after that day, it became a place of grief, a place I swore I would never return to. Yet somehow, years later, I found myself standing on the shore once again, the water eerily still, as though it were waiting for something. The cabin was exactly as I remembered it. The dock, the trees, even the weathered old rowboat still tied to the pier. But there was something different about the air, an unnatural quiet that made my skin prickle. I had come back to find answers, to understand what had happened all those years ago. My parents never spoke about it, the town never mentioned it, and the search parties had turned up nothing. It was as if my brother had just disappeared. And yet, deep down, I knew the lake held the key to his fate. The first night was uneventful, though sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my brother's face, the way he had looked that last day, happy, carefree, running toward the water with a wide grin. I had been with him on the dock when he went in for a swim, just like we always did. But when I turned my back for a moment and looked again, he was gone. No splash, no cry for help, just gone. The memory haunted me, as did the whispers of the townspeople, stories of others who had disappeared near the lake, all without a trace. The second night, I heard it. It started as a faint sound, so soft I thought it was just the wind rustling through the trees. But as the night grew darker, the sound became clearer. Whispers coming from the direction of the lake. I sat up in bed, straining to listen, but the words were too faint, too distorted. My heart raced as I crept to the window, peering out at the water. The lake was shrouded in fog, the surface smooth as glass. But I could feel something there, something watching. I couldn't sleep after that. The whispers continued, growing louder, more insistent, as if they were calling me. The voice was familiar, hauntingly so. It sounded like my brother. I tried to tell myself it wasn't possible, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but the pull of the lake was undeniable. I found myself walking down to the dock in the dead of night, the whispers guiding me, urging me closer. The fog hung thick over the water, and for a moment I thought I saw a figure standing on the opposite shore, too far to make out, but unmistakably human. I called out, but the figure didn't move. The whispers grew louder, echoing around me, and the figure vanished into the fog. My heart pounded as I stood there, staring out at the water. The whispers were so clear now, almost like a chant, rising and falling with the rhythm of the lake's gentle waves. I took a step closer, my feet barely touching the edge of the dock, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw my brother's reflection in the water. His face staring back at me, his eyes wide with fear. I stumbled back, gasping for air. The reflection was gone, but the whispers remained, filling the air with an urgency I couldn't ignore. I ran back to the cabin, locking the door behind me, but the whispers followed me, seeping through the walls, through the very fabric of the night. It was him. I was sure of it now. My brother was calling to me from the lake, trapped in whatever darkness had taken him all those years ago. But what did he want? And why was he still there? The next morning, I went into town, desperate for answers. I spoke to the locals, some of whom remembered the tragedy, but most were hesitant to say much. One old man, who had lived in Crestview his entire life, pulled me aside. He told me the lake had a history. Long before my brother's disappearance, people had gone missing. The native tribes that once lived in the area believed the lake was cursed, that it had a spirit living within it, one that lured people to their deaths. Once the lake takes someone, he said, they're never truly gone. They become part of it. That night, I couldn't stay away from the lake. I needed to know the truth, needed to hear the whispers one more time. I walked down to the dock, the fog rolling in thick, the air cold and still. The lake seemed darker than before, its surface like black glass. As I stood there, the whispers began again, louder, clearer, and this time, I could understand the words, "Come closer." I waded into the water, the cold seeping into my bones. The whispers surrounded me now, filling my ears, pulling me deeper. I reached the spot where my brother had disappeared, my legs trembling with fear. And then I saw it, a hand, pale and ghostly, reaching up from beneath the surface, followed by my brother's face, his eyes wide with terror. He was trapped, just as the old man had said, a part of the lake now, forever bound to its dark waters. I stumbled back to shore, gasping for breath. The whispers faded, but I knew they would return. The lake had taken him, and now it wanted me too. I left Crestview the next morning, vowing never to return. But even now, miles away, I can still hear the lake's whispers in my dreams, calling me back, waiting for the day when I'll give in. When I first moved into the charming old house on Ridgecrest, it felt like a fresh start. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where people greeted you with a smile, and everyone took pride in their well-manicured lawns. My new home was a beautiful Victorian, full of character and history, and I couldn't wait to settle in. It was everything I had been looking for, or so I thought. That was before the letters started arriving. It began innocently enough. A single letter in my mailbox, with no return address. The handwriting was neat, almost too perfect, and the message was short but strange. Stay out of the basement. I thought it was a joke, maybe some prank from the local kids welcoming the new neighbor. I laughed it off and didn't think much of it. After all, there was nothing unusual about the basement. I had already been down there, and it was just an old storage space, dusty and cluttered with the belongings of previous owners. A few days later, I received another letter. This one warned me about the attic. Keep the attic door locked. Again, no return address, no signature. My curiosity grew. I hadn't even explored the attic yet, so I decided to take a look. When I climbed the creaky old ladder and opened the attic door, everything seemed normal. Boxes filled with forgotten memories, old furniture, and cobwebs. Nothing out of the ordinary. Still, the letters had left me with an uneasy feeling, as though someone was watching me. Over the next week, more letters arrived, each one more unsettling than the last. Don't go near the cellar. Keep the windows locked at night. Whatever you do, don't answer the door after midnight. The tone of the letters became increasingly urgent, as though someone was trying to warn me about something. I didn't know what to think. I hadn't seen any of my neighbors since moving in, and I began to wonder if they were responsible for the letters. But every house on the street seemed eerily quiet, their windows always dark, as if no one lived there at all. One night, I woke up to the sound of faint knocking. It was coming from the front door, soft, rhythmic, almost polite. My heart raced as I remembered the latest letter's warning, "Don't answer the door after midnight." I glanced at the clock. It was 12:03. The knocking continued, steady and insistent. I stayed frozen in bed, barely daring to breathe. After what felt like an eternity, the knocking stopped and the house fell into silence. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, there was another letter waiting for me. This time, it wasn't in the mailbox. It had been slipped under my door during the night. "They're coming for you. Get out." My blood ran cold as I read the words. The sense of dread that had been growing since the first letter now settled deep in my bones. I knew I had to find out what was going on. But as much as I wanted to leave, something held me there. An inexplicable pull that kept me rooted to the house. That afternoon, I decided to visit the local library to research the history of my home. What I found was chilling. Decades ago, the house had belonged to the Ridge family, who were well known in the community. One night, the entire family disappeared without a trace. Some said they had been murdered, others believed they had been cursed. Their bodies were never found, and the house had remained vacant for years before being sold to a series of owners, all of whom had left abruptly. The more I read, the more I realized that something terrible had happened in the house, and whatever it wasn't over. That night, the knocking returned. This time, it wasn't just at the front door. It echoed through the house, coming from the basement, the attic, even the walls. I could hear whispers too, faint voices calling my name, urging me to leave. I tried to ignore it, but the noise grew louder, more frantic, until I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and called the police, but the line was dead. Every attempt to reach the outside world was met with silence. I was trapped. Desperate, I remembered the letters and their warnings. I locked every door and window, and then I went to the basement, determined to find out what was hidden down there. The moment I opened the door, a wave of cold air hit me, and I heard a low, growling sound coming from the darkness. I shined my flashlight around, but the beam barely pierced the gloom. Then I saw it, a shadowy figure standing at the far end of the room, watching me. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and as I backed away, I felt something brush against my arm. I bolted out of the basement, slamming the door behind me. That was when I noticed the final letter on the kitchen table. It hadn't been there before. My hands shook as I opened it. You didn't listen. Now they're here. I dropped the letter and ran to the front door, but it wouldn't budge. The windows were sealed shut, the air in the house thick with an oppressive presence. The whispers grew louder, and the knocking resumed, this time more forceful, more demanding. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner of the living room, waiting for the sun to rise. When it finally did, the knocking stopped, and the whispers faded. I didn't waste any time. I packed my bags and left Ridgecrest that morning, not bothering to say goodbye to anyone. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the house standing there, silent and still, as though nothing had ever happened. But I knew the truth. The ghostly neighbors of Ridgecrest are always watching, waiting for their next victim. And if you ever move there, you'd better listen to the warnings, or you might not make it out. The Victorian mansion we bought had always been a dream home. The high ceilings, the intricate woodwork, the sprawling garden, it was everything we could have wanted. But there was one thing we hadn't anticipated: the locked room. It sat at the top of the house, a small door on the third floor that refused to open. The previous owners had told us it had been sealed for as long as they could remember. "Don't worry about it," they said with a smile. "Some things are better left undisturbed." Of course, that only made us more curious. My husband Alex was particularly intrigued. He loved old houses, especially ones with a bit of mystery. After we settled in, he became obsessed with the locked room. No matter what he tried, the door wouldn't budge. He even brought in a locksmith, who scratched his head and said he'd never seen anything like it. It was as though the house itself didn't want the room opened. Weeks passed, and I tried to ignore the door, focusing on turning the rest of the house into our dream home. But Alex wouldn't let it go. "We have to know what's in there," he kept saying. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Something about that door gave me the creeps. Every time I passed it, I felt a cold draft, like the air on the other side was somehow different. Older, darker. One night, Alex finally broke through. He had been working on the door for hours, using a crowbar to pry it open. I was downstairs trying to block out the sound when I heard a loud crash followed by silence. I rushed upstairs, heart pounding, and found the door hanging open. Alex stood there staring into the room, his face pale. "You need to see this," he whispered. I stepped into the room, and what I saw sent a chill down my spine. It was a nursery, perfectly preserved as though frozen in time. The wallpaper was faded but intact, decorated with delicate, hand-painted designs. Toys were scattered across the floor, and in the corner stood a crib, draped with a lace canopy. The air in the room was stale, thick with dust, but it wasn't the stillness that unnerved me. It was the feeling that we weren't alone. On one of the walls, a portrait hung, an old painting of a woman holding a baby. Her eyes seemed to follow us as we moved through the room, and the baby in her arms looked almost too real, its face etched with an expression of fear. As I stared at the portrait, I felt a strange sensation wash over me, like someone, or something, was watching us from the shadows. That night, the nightmares started. I dreamed of the nursery, but in the dream, it wasn't empty. A baby's cries echoed through the room, followed by the soft, rhythmic creak of a rocking chair. I would wake up drenched in sweat, the sound of those cries still ringing in my ears. Alex had nightmares too, though he wouldn't talk about them. He grew distant, spending more and more time in the locked room, as if something was drawing him back there. Then strange things began happening around the house. Toys from the nursery would appear in different rooms. Small wooden blocks, a ragged stuffed bear. Though neither of us had moved them. The air grew colder, and sometimes late at night, we'd hear the sound of a baby crying, faint but unmistakable. It always seemed to come from the locked room. One evening, I found the crib rocking on its own, the canopy swaying gently as though someone had just tucked a child into bed. We tried to ignore it, telling ourselves it was just our minds playing tricks. But deep down, we knew the truth. Something had been waiting in that room, and by opening the door, we had unleashed it. The portrait of the woman haunted me. Her eyes were so lifelike, filled with sorrow and something darker, resentment. I began to wonder if she had once lived in the house, if the baby in the portrait had died in that very room. The thought chilled me to the bone. One night, I woke to find Alex missing. I searched the house, panic rising in my chest, until I found him standing in the nursery, staring down at the crib. His face was pale, his eyes glazed over. "She's here," he whispered. "She wants the baby back." I grabbed his arm, pulling him away from the crib, but he resisted, his eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. The temperature in the room plummeted, and the door slammed shut behind us. Desperate to escape, I dragged Alex out of the room, my heart racing as the baby's cries grew louder, more insistent. We locked the door behind us, but the house had changed. The air was thick with tension, and every night, the crying continued. We couldn't sleep, couldn't think. The nursery was always on our minds, gnawing at us with a presence we couldn't explain. Finally, we called a medium. She arrived the next day, her face grim as she entered the house. After walking through the rooms, she stopped in front of the locked door. "This room holds a terrible grief," she said. "A child was lost here, and the mother's spirit never left. She's trapped, searching for her baby, and now she's drawn to you. The medium performed a cleansing ritual, but even she looked uneasy as she left. The spirit may never rest, she warned. This house will always remember. We moved out the next day, leaving the house and its tragic secret behind. But sometimes late at night, I still hear the faint sound of a baby crying, and I wonder if, somewhere in that house, the locked room remains open, waiting for its next occupants to discover what we never should have. It all started when we moved into Willow House. We were thrilled, our first home together with its charming exterior and vintage feel. But almost immediately, something felt off. At night, I would hear faint whispers, like someone was having a quiet conversation in the next room. My partner thought I was imagining things, but I knew I wasn't alone. The air was thick with something chilling, though I couldn't put my finger on it. A few days later, it wasn't just whispers. Objects began to move. Small things like my keys or a book would shift when no one was around. The eeriest thing happened when I saw a glimpse of movement in the mirror, a shadow passing behind me, though no one else was in the house. I started smelling a sweet perfume, the kind an older woman might wear, even though I didn't own anything like it. It lingered in the air, haunting me every evening. I started digging into the history of the house, and what I found was disturbing. The previous owner, a widow, had lived here alone after her husband's sudden and mysterious death. The neighborhood whispered about her disappearance. One day she was just gone, leaving the house eerily silent. As I read through old articles, I realized the dates matched up with the nights I heard the whispers. She wasn't gone. She was still here, watching, waiting. Things escalated quickly. One night, I woke up to the sensation of cold fingers brushing my cheek. I jolted upright, but no one was there. My partner was sound asleep, unaware of the eerie occurrences that had me on edge. I was beginning to fear that whatever or whoever was here didn't want us to stay. The house seemed to pulse with an unsettling energy, like it was trying to communicate something I didn't yet understand. Desperate, I reached out to a local historian, hoping to learn more about the widow. That's when I discovered the real horror. The widow had been searching for someone to join her ever since her husband's death. People believed she had performed strange rituals, trying to connect with his spirit, and now it seemed she had her eyes set on us. Every time we talked about leaving the house, something would happen. Lights would flicker, doors would slam shut. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was all in my head, but the occurrences grew more violent. One night, as we sat watching TV, the reflection of the widow appeared in the mirror above the fireplace. Her expression was blank, but her eyes were locked on us. My partner finally saw it too. We were no longer alone in this. The house had a chilling way of making sure we stayed, as if it wouldn't let us leave. The final straw came when I found a letter hidden in the walls during one of our small renovation projects. It was addressed to the next resident, and it was from the widow herself. She wrote about her loneliness, about how she never truly left after her husband died. The letter ended with a simple, terrifying message: "I'm waiting for you." The house groaned as I read the words, like it was alive, like it wanted to swallow us whole. That night, the house became unbearable. We were woken by the sound of heavy footsteps pacing the hallway, back and forth, back and forth. It was relentless. I knew it was her. I could feel her presence as if she were standing right beside me. The perfume was stronger than ever, so thick I could hardly breathe. My partner was terrified, and for the first time, we agreed we needed to leave. But the house had other plans. As we packed our things, the doors wouldn't open. The windows wouldn't budge. We were trapped, just like the widow had been, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. It felt like the house was pulling us deeper into its dark history, like it was trying to consume us. The haunting presence of the widow was everywhere, and I could feel her icy grip tightening around us. We barely made it out. After what felt like hours of struggling, we managed to break a window and escape. As we ran into the street, the house stood silent behind us, but I knew it wasn't over. The widow was still there, waiting for her next opportunity. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and for a split second, I saw her standing in the window watching us leave. We never went back. The haunting never really left us, though. Even now, years later, I sometimes catch the scent of that sweet perfume or hear faint whispers in the dead of night. Willow House isn't just a place, it's a feeling, a memory that clings to you long after you've gone. And though we escaped, I know the spirits still linger there, waiting for someone new to join them. When I first moved into the little cottage at the base of Maple Hill, it felt like a dream come true. It was quaint, cozy, and surrounded by a beautiful, peaceful forest. I didn't know much about its history, but the price was right, and the charm of the place was irresistible. For the first few nights, everything seemed normal, quiet even. But then, things started happening that I couldn't explain. It began with small, chilling sounds late at night, the distant echo of a child crying, faint but unmistakable. I figured it was just the wind, but the more I listened, the more it sounded real. One morning as I got up to make coffee, I noticed something strange. Muddy footprints tracked across the floor from the front door to the living room. The odd thing was, it had been a dry night, and I hadn't been outside. The footprints were small, as if a child had walked through the house while I slept. That's when I started to get nervous. I double-checked all the locks, but everything was secure. I told myself I must have missed something. There had to be a logical explanation. A week later, I learned about the cottage's dark past from a neighbor. The previous owner had been a grieving father, devastated by the disappearance of his young daughter years ago. Apparently, she vanished without a trace while playing in the woods near the cottage, and the father never recovered. He spent the rest of his life searching for her, convinced she was still out there somewhere. Eventually, the man died in that very cottage, alone and heartbroken. As I listened to the story, a haunting feeling crept over me. Could his grief have left something behind? After hearing that, the strange occurrences only intensified. The crying I'd heard at night became louder, almost as if it were coming from right outside my window. I'd rush outside to check, but of course, there was nothing there. Only the stillness of the woods. More footprints appeared, sometimes in odd places like the ceiling or walls, as if someone was trying to walk through every inch of the house. Each time it happened, I felt a weight in the air, a presence I couldn't shake. Things took a darker turn when I began seeing glimpses of the father himself. Late at night, just as I was about to drift off, I'd catch a shadow moving at the edge of my vision, standing by the door or pacing by the window. He never fully appeared, but I could sense his presence. It was as if he was watching me, waiting for something. I couldn't help but wonder if he thought I knew where his daughter was, or worse, if he was trying to get me to help him find her. One night, the crying was so loud it jolted me awake, my heart pounding in my chest. This time, it wasn't outside. It was coming from inside the house, echoing through the halls. I got up and followed the sound, trembling as I made my way down the stairs. As I reached the living room, I saw them, muddy footprints, leading straight to a chair by the window. And there, just for a moment, I saw the outline of a man sitting there, staring out into the woods. Then, just as quickly, he vanished. That was the moment I knew I couldn't stay. The house wasn't just haunted, it was consumed by grief, and it wasn't letting go of its past. The father's soul was restless, still searching, still waiting for answers. I felt like I was being drawn into his obsession, as if he believed I could somehow bring his daughter back. The eerie weight of it all pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. I didn't know how to help him, or if I even could. I tried ignoring it, pretending like it wasn't happening. But that didn't work. The more I ignored it, the more aggressive the hauntings became. Doors would slam shut on their own, and the crying turned into screams. One night, I woke up to find the entire living room covered in muddy footprints, circling around me as if the father was trying to trap me there. I could feel his desperation, his grief, and his anger. I had to leave. I packed my bags and called a moving company the next morning, determined to get out before things got worse. But as I was leaving, I found something that made me stop in my tracks. A small, dirty shoe hidden beneath the floorboards in the living room. It was old, worn, and covered in mud, but it was unmistakably a child's shoe. That's when I realized the truth. The father had been right. His daughter had never left. She had died, hidden in the house all along, and he had been searching for her in vain. I took the shoe and buried it in the woods, hoping it would give both of them peace. For a moment, I felt the air lighten, as if the cottage itself had taken a deep breath. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still there. Father and daughter, bound together by grief and loss, forever searching for what they could never truly find. Even now, as I write this, I can still hear the faint sound of crying in my dreams. I wonder if I'll ever forget it, or if they'll ever truly rest. When we first moved into Brookside Manor, I was captivated by its grand architecture. The old house stood on the outskirts of town, hidden behind tall, weathered trees, as if guarding its secrets. My family saw potential in its faded beauty, planning to restore it to its former glory. But almost immediately, something felt off. On the first night, as we unpacked, I could swear I heard soft voices whispering from the walls. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but the feeling of being watched lingered, chilling me to my core. A few days later, I started seeing strange flickers of movement from the corners of my eyes, shadowy figures darting away the moment I turned to look. My husband brushed it off, claiming it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, but I knew something was wrong. The eerie atmosphere of the manor clung to me like a second skin, growing heavier with each passing day. The rooms were beautiful, yet suffocating, as if they were holding on to something dark. I became obsessed with finding out more about Brookside Manor's history. After some research, I learned that the house had once been a makeshift hospital during a deadly flu epidemic decades ago. Hundreds of people had passed through its doors, but not all of them had left alive. The idea of living in a place where so much suffering had taken place made my skin crawl. The more I read, the more I realized that the house wasn't just haunted. It was a graveyard of lost souls. At night, the strange occurrences escalated. The whispers grew louder, and the shadows became bolder. I would feel cold gusts of air pass through the rooms, even though all the windows were sealed tight. One evening, while I was in the kitchen, I saw a flicker of movement in the reflection of the window, a pale face staring at me from behind. When I turned around, no one was there. The haunting presence of the house was growing stronger, and I couldn't escape the feeling that something didn't want us there. I tried to ignore it, but it became impossible when my daughter started hearing the voices too. She told me about her new friend, a little girl she played with in the attic. The attic had been locked since we moved in, and we hadn't even touched it. The thought of her playing with someone, or something, I couldn't see sent a shiver down my spine. I knew then that the spirits of Brookside Manor weren't just restless, they were interacting with us, and I had no idea what they wanted. One night, after hearing footsteps in the hallway, I decided to confront whatever was haunting us. Armed with a flashlight, I ventured into the dark halls. As I passed by one of the bedrooms, I heard a faint cough, like someone was struggling to breathe. My heart raced, but I pushed forward, determined to find the source. I entered the attic and found it covered in dust, untouched for years. Yet, I could feel eyes on me, watching. And then, in the dim light, I saw her, a young girl standing in the corner, her eyes full of sorrow. The encounter shook me, but it wasn't until I spoke with the town historian that I understood the full scope of what was happening. Many of the patients who died at Brookside Manor during the epidemic were children. They had been brought there to recover, but most never left. Their spirits, trapped by illness and fear, still wandered the halls, seeking the comfort they were denied in life. But not all of them were harmless. One spirit, in particular, was filled with rage. The spirit of a nurse who had been accused of negligence during the outbreak. She had died in the manor, and her fury hadn't been laid to rest. As I pieced the story together, the hauntings became more aggressive. Doors slammed on their own, objects moved, and the oppressive energy in the house grew unbearable. I couldn't shake the feeling that the angry nurse's spirit was targeting us, trying to drive us out. One night, I woke up to the sound of my daughter screaming. I rushed to her room, only to find her standing by the window, staring blankly outside. She pointed to the yard, where I saw a faint figure, standing by the tree line, watching the house. That was the final straw. We needed to leave. The house didn't want us, and I feared for my family's safety. We packed our things as quickly as we could, but the house seemed to fight back. As we carried boxes to the car, the front door slammed shut, trapping us inside. It felt as if the very walls were closing in, pushing us out, but keeping us trapped at the same time. The chilling weight of the spirits was palpable, and I could feel their desperation. It wasn't until we finally made it to the car that the house seemed to release its grip on us. As we drove away, I looked back at Brookside Manor one last time. The shadows in the windows were still there, watching us go. I knew we had escaped, but the spirits of the manor would remain, forever tied to the tragedy that unfolded within its walls. Brookside Manor may look like just another old house from the outside, but it's far more than that. It's a tomb, filled with the echoes of the past, and the spirits trapped within its walls will never find peace. We were lucky to get out when we did, but not everyone who steps through its doors is so fortunate. I had always dreamed of owning a farmhouse, so when I found the old place on Old Mill Road, it seemed like fate. The house was run down, sure, but it had charm. The kind of charm that made me want to fix it up and call it home. Little did I know, the land had its own secrets, and the farmhouse held on to them tightly. The first few weeks were uneventful. I spent my days cleaning, repairing, and imagining what the place would look like once I was done. But then things started to change. It began with small, almost unnoticeable occurrences. The barn door, which I made sure to lock every night, would be wide open by morning. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the locks were never broken and the latch was always secure. It was eerie, but I shrugged it off, thinking maybe I just hadn't closed it properly. That was my first mistake, assuming the house's oddities were harmless. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard it, the creak of footsteps outside, near the barn. My heart raced, and I peeked out the window, expecting to see an intruder. Instead, I saw a shadowy figure standing by the barn, barely illuminated by the moonlight. He was tall, with a wide-brimmed hat, and though I couldn't see his face, I felt his gaze on me. Chilled to the bone, I hurried downstairs to investigate, but by the time I reached the yard, the figure was gone. The barn door, however, was swinging open. I started asking around in town, trying to learn more about the farmhouse's history. What I found out was chilling. Years ago, the original owner had been found dead in the barn. No one knew how or why. The locals whispered about a curse on the land, that the farmer's spirit still wandered, protecting the property from anyone who didn't belong. It explained the strange occurrences, but I still didn't believe in ghosts. At least, not yet. As the days passed, the sightings became more frequent. Every night, the figure would stand by the barn, watching the house, and every morning, the barn door would be wide open again. It was as though he was trying to send me a message, though I couldn't figure out what. The nights were the worst, filled with creaks and groans, like the house itself was alive, breathing beneath my feet. Then one evening, while I was working late, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps inside the barn. I grabbed a flashlight and headed outside, determined to face whatever, or whoever was haunting the place. As I entered the barn, the air grew cold, and I saw him again. The farmer, standing in the shadows, his face still hidden, but this time, he moved toward me. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, the barn was plunged into darkness. When the light came back on, he was gone, but the feeling of dread remained. I could sense it now. This was no friendly spirit. He wasn't just watching me, he was warning me. I had disturbed something sacred, and now I was paying the price. The next day I tried to put the house up for sale, but no one was interested. The townspeople knew the stories, and they weren't about to take a chance on cursed land. Desperate, I contacted a local historian who specialized in hauntings. He came to the house and spent the night in the barn, hoping to communicate with the spirit. The next morning he told me something I'll never forget. The farmer wasn't protecting the land, he was trapped there. His death had been violent, and his soul was bound to the barn, unable to move on until someone uncovered the truth. The historian warned me to be careful, that once a spirit knows you're aware of its presence, it becomes even more dangerous. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the barn door creak open again, followed by footsteps coming toward the house. I froze, fear gripping me as the sound grew closer. The figure appeared at the window, staring in with cold, hollow eyes. This time, he didn't disappear. Instead, he stood there, motionless, watching me until the first light of dawn. I left Old Mill Road the next day, abandoning my dream of restoring the farmhouse. Some places, I realized, aren't meant to be lived in. They belong to the past, and no amount of renovation can change that. I don't know what happened to the next owner, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear the creak of that barn door in my dreams, and I wonder if the farmer is still there, standing guard, waiting for someone else to disturb his land. The moment we moved into the house on Langdon Street, we knew it needed work. It was an old fixer-upper, and we were excited to bring it back to life. But from the very first night, something felt off. It wasn't just the creaks and groans of an old house settling, it was the feeling that we weren't alone. At first, it was subtle. We'd hear footsteps upstairs when no one was there, and every night, like clockwork, a strange smell of burning wood would fill the house at exactly 3:15 a.m. It was eerie, but we chalked it up to the house's age. How wrong we were. After a few weeks, the occurrences became harder to ignore. I'd be working on repairs in the living room, and out of nowhere, I'd hear a loud bang from upstairs. But when I went to check, nothing was out of place. My wife started complaining that she felt like someone was watching her, especially in the hallway leading to the bedrooms. Even our dog, normally calm, would growl at empty spaces, his fur standing on end. Then came the night when things took a darker turn. We were both in bed, trying to sleep, when the sound of footsteps echoed through the house, heavy, deliberate footsteps. They started upstairs, then slowly made their way down the stairs. Step by step, we both sat up listening, our hearts pounding. I grabbed a flashlight and went to check, but no one was there. The house was silent, but that strange smell of burning wood had returned, stronger than ever. Desperate for answers, we visited the local historical society to learn more about the house. What we discovered was chilling. Over a century ago, the house had been built on the site of a devastating fire that had claimed the lives of an entire family. The fire had broken out in the middle of the night, and the family had been trapped inside, unable to escape. The time of the fire? 3:15 a.m. The exact time the burning smell filled our house every night. The realization hit hard. The spirits of the family hadn't moved on. They were still here, reliving their final moments over and over, trying to warn anyone living in the house of the tragedy that had befallen them. The footsteps, the smell of burning wood, the sense of being watched. It was all connected, and it was getting worse. One evening, as we were preparing dinner, the kitchen lights flickered, and then, for a brief moment, we both saw it. A shadowy figure standing at the edge of the room, watching us. It was a man, tall and thin, with dark, hollow eyes. As quickly as he appeared, he vanished, leaving us both shaken. We knew then that the spirits weren't just lingering, they were trying to communicate with us, to warn us of something. But what? The next night, I decided to stay up and see if anything happened at 3:15 a.m. Sure enough, just as the clock struck, the house filled with the smell of burning wood, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the halls. But this time, there was something new. A faint whisper, almost inaudible but unmistakable. "Get out." My heart raced, and I knew we couldn't stay in the house any longer. We packed our bags and left the house that very night. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the spirits had been trying to protect us. Maybe they weren't warning us about their own deaths, but about something that was coming. Something that would happen to us if we stayed. The house had claimed one family, and it wouldn't hesitate to claim another. Weeks later, we heard from the new owners of the house. They, too, experienced the same eerie occurrences. Footsteps, burning smells, and shadows in the corners of their vision. But they refused to leave. I wonder sometimes if they'll make it out before the house's dark history repeats itself. Because some houses, like the one on Langdon Street, hold on to their past with a grip so tight, no one can escape the echoes. I inherited Seaside House from my grandmother, a charming old home perched on a cliff overlooking the ocean. As a child, I'd spent summers there, but I never knew much about its past. The house had been in our family for generations, and everyone in town seemed to know the legends surrounding it. They talked about the Widow's Watch, a small tower at the top of the house where wives of sailors would wait for their husbands to return from sea. But one story stood out, about a woman who threw herself from the tower when her husband's ship never came back. Her ghost, they said, still lingered, waiting for him. At first, I didn't think much of it. The house was old, and with its creaky floors and drafty windows, it had a spooky charm, but nothing more. I spent the first few days cleaning and organizing, trying to bring some life back to the place. But every night, without fail, I'd hear the sound of faint weeping coming from the tower. At first, I thought it was the wind. After all, the ocean breeze was relentless. But the weeping was unmistakable, a soft, sorrowful sound that seemed to come from deep within the house. One stormy night, the weeping grew louder, and I decided to investigate. Climbing the narrow staircase to the Widow's Watch, I felt a cold chill run down my spine. The air was thick, and the closer I got to the top, the more uneasy I felt. When I reached the tower, I found nothing but a dusty old window overlooking the sea. But as I stood there, staring out at the stormy waves, I felt something behind me, a presence, cold and heavy, as if someone was standing right there, watching me. I spun around, but no one was there. The room was empty, save for the dust and the sound of the storm outside. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I turned to leave, I felt it, a pair of icy hands on my shoulders, pushing me toward the window. My heart raced as I struggled to keep my balance, feeling the pressure urging me closer and closer to the edge. I broke free and bolted down the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The next morning, I told myself it had been a nightmare, a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I knew that something was wrong with Seaside House. I started asking around town, hoping to learn more about the woman who had died there. The locals were hesitant to talk, but eventually I pieced together the story. The woman, Mary, had lost her husband at sea, and after waiting months for his return, she threw herself from the tower in despair. Ever since, her spirit had haunted the house, waiting for him to come back. As the days went on, the hauntings intensified. Every time a storm rolled in, I'd hear the weeping, and each time I went to the tower, I felt the same icy hands pulling me toward the window. It was as if Mary wanted me to join her in her endless vigil. I began to fear the house, dreading each night when the wind would howl and the waves would crash against the cliffs. The Widow's Watch loomed over me, a constant reminder of the tragedy that had taken place there. One evening, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my bags, ready to leave Seaside House behind. But as I stood in the front hall, a storm began to brew outside, and the weeping started once again. This time, it was louder, more desperate, as if Mary knew I was trying to leave. Against my better judgment, I climbed the stairs one last time, determined to confront whatever was haunting the tower. When I reached the top, the air was freezing. The window rattled in the wind, and as I approached it, I saw her, just for a moment. A woman in a white gown, her face pale and twisted with sorrow, staring out at the sea. She turned to me, her eyes hollow, and I felt the same icy grip on my shoulders. But this time, I didn't run. I stood my ground and spoke to her, telling her that her husband wasn't coming back, that she didn't have to wait anymore. The room grew still, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of understanding in her ghostly eyes. Then, as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone. The air warmed and the weeping stopped. I stood in the tower for what felt like hours, staring out at the sea, waiting for the storm to pass. And when it did, I knew that Mary had finally let go. I left Seaside House that week, but I'll never forget the haunting sound of her cries or the feeling of her hands on my shoulders. Some spirits, I realized, are bound not by anger, but by sorrow, trapped in a cycle of waiting for something that will never come. And sometimes, the only way to free them is to remind them that it's time to move on. We thought a weekend getaway in a remote cabin would be the perfect escape. Hollow Creek Cabin was tucked deep in the woods, far from the chaos of city life. It sounded peaceful. No cell service, no distractions, just us and the quiet of nature. My friends and I were excited for the break, but from the moment we arrived, something about the place felt off. The air was heavy, almost oppressive, and there was a strange stillness in the forest around us, as if the woods were holding their breath. We ignored it, eager to enjoy our weekend, but Hollow Creek had its own plans. The first night, we were sitting around the fire when we noticed it, figures moving in the trees just beyond the cabin. At first, we thought it was wildlife, but as we watched, we realized the shapes were human-like, but they didn't seem quite right. They moved too quickly, too silently, flickering in and out of sight like shadows. One of my friends joked that we'd stumbled into a haunted forest, but his laugh was strained. We all felt it. Something eerie was out there, watching us. Later that night, as we settled into our bunks, I heard it. Soft whispers outside the cabin, calling our names. My heart pounded, and I lay there frozen, straining to hear more. The whispers continued, growing louder, more insistent, until I was certain someone, or something, was right outside the door. I wasn't the only one who heard it. In the morning, my friends confessed that they too had heard the voices. We laughed it off, trying to brush away the lingering fear, but the unease clung to us like a shadow. The next day, we explored the woods, hoping to shake off the weirdness of the night before. But as we ventured deeper, the forest grew darker, the trees thicker, and that oppressive feeling returned. We stumbled upon old, crumbling stone foundations hidden beneath the overgrowth. It looked like a settlement had once been here, long ago. As we stood there, the temperature dropped, and we heard the sound of footsteps approaching, though there was no one in sight. We ran back to the cabin, trying to laugh off our fear, but inside, we all knew something was terribly wrong. That night, the shadows came closer. As we sat by the fire again, we saw them, figures moving between the trees, watching us. They were clearer now, more defined, though their faces were hidden in the darkness. We huddled together, unsure of what to do. The whispers returned, louder this time, echoing through the clearing around the cabin. It felt like the forest itself was alive, and it didn't want us there. One of my friends, Sam, decided he'd had enough. "We're leaving in the morning," he said, his voice shaking. But as soon as he said it, the cabin door creaked open on its own. We all stared in horror as a cold wind blew through the room, extinguishing the fire. The shadows outside seemed to grow, pressing in closer, and we could hear the voices now. Dozens of them, whispering, pleading, angry. We tried to sleep that night, but none of us could. The cabin felt like a cage, and the forest outside was closing in. By morning, Sam was gone. His bed was empty, and the front door was wide open. Panic set in as we searched the woods, calling his name, but all we found were footprints leading into the forest. Footprints that disappeared at the edge of the old foundations we'd found the day before. We tried to call for help, but there was no signal, no way to reach the outside world. It felt as though we were trapped in a place where time didn't move, where the forest had swallowed us whole. Desperate, we packed our things and decided to leave immediately. But the forest had other plans. As we trekked through the trees, the shadows followed us, always just out of reach, whispering, watching. The path we had taken to the cabin seemed to twist and turn in ways we didn't remember, and soon we were hopelessly lost. The forest was alive, and it was playing with us, leading us in circles, keeping us from leaving. By nightfall, we found ourselves back at the cabin. Exhausted and terrified, we huddled inside, barricading the door and windows. The shadows pressed closer, and the whispers became deafening. It felt like the forest was closing in on us, suffocating us. One by one, my friends disappeared, swallowed by the darkness, their voices joining the chorus of whispers outside. I was the last one left. As the shadows filled the cabin, I realized the truth. The settlement we had stumbled upon hadn't been abandoned. It had been consumed. The spirits of those who had lived there were still trapped, bound to the land, and now we had become part of their cursed history. The shadows weren't just watching us, they were claiming us, one by one. In the end, I don't know how I escaped. Maybe they let me go to tell their story, or maybe I'm still trapped in the forest, reliving the nightmare over and over. But one thing is certain. Hollow Creek Cabin isn't just a place in the woods. It's a graveyard, where the past never dies and the shadows are always watching, waiting for their next victim. When I first moved into Bellevue Apartments, I was thrilled to find a place so affordable in the heart of the city. The building itself was old, with that vintage charm I'd always loved. Ornate iron balconies, high ceilings, and wide hallways that seemed to stretch forever. But there was something odd about the place. It wasn't just the creaky floors or the peeling wallpaper. It was the residents. They were eerily quiet, almost like they were avoiding me. No one ever made eye contact, and when I tried to introduce myself, they'd just stare blankly before walking away. At first I thought it was just city life, but soon I realized there was something much darker going on. It started with strange noises at night. Around 2 a.m., I'd hear doors creaking open and footsteps echoing down the hall outside my apartment. I figured it was just my neighbors coming home late, but when I peeked out through the peephole, the hallway was always empty. The noises continued, night after night, and each time I checked, there was no one there. It was unsettling, but not enough to make me want to leave. Yet. Then came the whispers. Late at night, when everything was silent, I'd hear soft voices murmuring just outside my door. They were faint, too quiet to make out the words, but unmistakably there. My skin would crawl as I lay in bed, straining to hear more, but the whispers always stayed just out of reach. It felt like the walls were alive, like the building itself was whispering secrets I wasn't meant to hear. The more I paid attention, the stranger things became. I started noticing that none of the other tenants ever seemed to leave their apartments. I'd hear the occasional shuffle of footsteps, but I never saw anyone going in or out of the building. The lights in the hallway were always dim, and sometimes, as I walked down the corridor, I'd feel eyes on me, like someone or something was watching from behind the closed doors. The atmosphere was chilling, and I began to feel trapped in my own home. One day, out of sheer curiosity, I decided to dig into the building's history. What I found was unsettling. Decades ago, Bellevue Apartments had been the site of a mass poisoning. A deranged tenant had laced the building's water supply with poison, killing nearly everyone inside. The authorities never figured out why he did it, but the building had been empty for years after the tragedy, left to rot. Eventually, it was renovated and put back on the market, but the haunting past still lingered. The victims of the poisoning, it seemed, had never left. I started to put the pieces together. The strange behavior of the residents, the whispers, the footsteps, those weren't living people. They were spirits, trapped in their final moments, forever replaying the last days of their lives. The realization sent a shiver down my spine. I was living in a building full of ghosts, and they didn't want me there. That night, the hauntings escalated. As I lay in bed, I heard the creaking of doors and the shuffle of footsteps, just like before. But this time, the footsteps stopped right outside my door. My heart raced as I heard a faint knock, followed by more whispers. Louder now, insistent, as though the spirits were trying to communicate. I held my breath, too terrified to move. Suddenly, my door rattled, as if someone was trying to open it. I shot out of bed, heart pounding, and grabbed the doorknob, holding it closed with all my strength. The rattling stopped, and the hallway fell silent once again. I knew I had to get out of Bellevue Apartments, but leaving wasn't as easy as I thought. The next day, I started packing my things, but every time I tried to leave, something went wrong. My keys disappeared, the elevator broke down, and the front door wouldn't budge, no matter how hard I pulled. It felt like the building was trapping me inside. Like the spirits weren't ready to let me go. As the days passed, I became more desperate. The whispers grew louder, following me wherever I went, and the shadows in the corners of my apartment seemed to flicker and shift, like they were watching me. I could feel the presence of the spirits more strongly now. Cold spots that moved through the rooms, the sense of being surrounded by unseen eyes. It was as if the entire building had come alive, feeding off my fear. One night, I woke to the sound of heavy breathing right next to my bed. My heart stopped as I slowly turned to see a shadowy figure standing over me, its face hidden in the darkness. I screamed, but no sound came out. The figure leaned closer, and in a raspy voice it whispered, "You can't leave." I bolted upright, drenched in sweat, and the figure was gone. But I knew then that the spirits weren't just restless, they were possessive. They didn't want me to leave because they needed me there. They needed someone living to keep their twisted loop going. The next morning, I didn't wait. I grabbed whatever I could carry, forced open the door, and ran. I didn't look back, not even when I heard the whispers following me down the hall. I left Bellevue Apartments that day, and I've never gone back. I later learned that the building remains empty, unable to keep any new tenants for long. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the faint sound of footsteps and whispers in my dreams, and I wonder if the spirits of Bellevue are still there, waiting for their next tenant. We thought buying Windley House was the opportunity of a lifetime. The sprawling estate with its towering windows and ornate architecture was exactly what we had been looking for to flip and sell for a huge profit. The price was suspiciously low, but we shrugged it off as a lucky break. The first few days were peaceful, almost too quiet. But as we settled in, strange things started happening, things that couldn't be explained. Books would fall off shelves without anyone near them, and we'd catch fleeting glimpses of figures in the reflections of the tall, dusty windows. At first, we laughed it off. Old houses have their quirks, we told ourselves, but the odd occurrences kept piling up. One night, I was in the library, leafing through some old books, when I felt a cold breeze pass by. All the windows were shut, but the temperature in the room dropped sharply. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadowy figure standing by the window. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Still, I could feel a presence, something chilling lingering in the room. We tried to carry on with our renovations, but Windley House wasn't making it easy. Tools went missing, ladders tipped over, and we began hearing strange noises at night. Footsteps in the halls, the sound of furniture being dragged across the floor, even though no one was upstairs. The eerie atmosphere was starting to get to us, but we were determined to finish the job. Little did we know, the house had other plans. The turning point came when we found the old journal hidden behind a false panel in one of the bedrooms. It belonged to a previous owner, a man who had mysteriously disappeared along with his entire family. His writing became more frantic as the entries progressed, detailing how the house seemed to come alive, how it whispered to him in the dead of night, urging him to leave. But he hadn't left, and neither had any of the other owners before us. The house had a history, and not a good one. Every single owner of Windley House had either gone mad or disappeared without a trace. The centerpiece of the estate was the massive library, which was rumored to be cursed. Books would fall from the shelves on their own, pages fluttering as if being read by unseen hands. And the windows, those towering windows, always seemed to show figures standing just beyond the glass, watching us, even when no one was outside. Then the dreams started. Every night, both of us would have vivid nightmares of the previous owners, warning us to leave before it was too late. They whispered of the curse that had consumed their lives, how the house fed on their fears and trapped them within its walls. We'd wake up in a cold sweat, feeling like we weren't alone in our own bed. It was as if the house had its claws in us, refusing to let go. One night, while working late in the library, I glanced at the large window and saw a figure staring back at me. A man, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, his face pale and eyes hollow. He didn't move, just watched me from the other side of the glass. My breath caught in my throat, and when I blinked, he was gone. But the fear that gripped me stayed. It wasn't just a hallucination. I had seen him. We decided we couldn't stay any longer. The house was cursed, and we knew it. But as we packed up, the hallucinations became worse. My partner began talking about the house as if it were alive, as if it had spoken to him. He insisted that we couldn't leave, that the house wouldn't let us go. I realized then that the house had already started to consume him, just like it had with the others. Desperate, I reached out to a local historian who had studied Windley House for years. He told me there was only one way to break the curse. We had to burn the library. The library was the heart of the house, where the curse had taken root. Destroying it was the only way to free ourselves and stop the house from claiming more victims. But burning down part of a house we had poured so much work into, it felt like madness. But in the end, we had no choice. Late one night, we gathered what little courage we had left and set fire to the library. As the flames roared to life, we heard it, a deep, guttural groan, like the house itself was in pain. The windows shattered, and for a brief moment, we saw them, the ghosts of the previous owners, standing in the flames, watching us with hollow eyes. When the fire finally died down, the house was still standing, but the curse was broken. We left Winley House that very night, never to return. The next owners would find nothing but a charred library and a haunting history. But as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was still watching us, waiting for its next victim. Urban exploring had always been a thrill for me, so when I heard about the old, abandoned schoolhouse on the edge of town, I couldn't resist checking it out. The place had been closed for decades, left to rot after a mysterious fire swept through it. The local kids would dare each other to go inside, but no one ever did. The moment I stepped inside, I understood why. The air was thick with dust and decay, and the long, empty hallways seemed to stretch on forever. There was something eerie about how time had stopped here. Old desks still lined the classrooms, children's drawings hung crooked on the walls, and textbooks lay open on long-forgotten lessons. As I wandered deeper into the school, I felt a strange chill in the air. The sunlight filtering through the broken windows seemed to fade, and the shadows grew longer. I brushed it off as nerves. After all, an empty schoolhouse at dusk was bound to feel creepy. But as I turned a corner, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. Carved into the walls were strange symbols, ones I couldn't recognize, but they sent a shiver down my spine. It was as if someone had been here recently, but the dust on the floor was undisturbed. I continued exploring, trying to ignore the unsettling atmosphere. But then, as I entered what must have once been the principal's office, I heard it, faint laughter echoing through the halls. I froze, straining to listen. The sound was distant but unmistakable, the laughter of children, playing, carefree. But the school had been abandoned for over 50 years. There couldn't possibly be anyone here. My heart raced, and I quickly made my way out of the office, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or maybe a bird. But deep down, I knew better. As I ventured toward the gymnasium, the laughter grew louder, accompanied by the faint sound of footsteps running down the halls. Every hair on my body stood on end, and I had the sudden, overwhelming feeling that I wasn't alone. I pushed open the door to the gym, half expecting to find someone inside, but it was empty. Dust floated through the air, illuminated by the last rays of daylight. But then I saw it. At the far end of the gym, standing in the shadows, was the faint figure of a teacher, watching me. My heart pounded in my chest as the figure slowly turned and walked away, disappearing through a side door. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to follow, to see if what I'd seen was real, but another part of me screamed to leave. Against my better judgment, I followed the figure into the hallway, where the air had grown even colder. The laughter had stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed down on me like a weight. As I made my way through the maze of hallways, I began to understand why no one had dared enter this place. The spirits of the children and teachers who had perished in the fire were still here, reliving their final moments over and over. I could feel their presence all around me, watching, waiting. The further I went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Every corner I turned, I half expected to see a face staring back at me. Then, without warning, the sound of children's laughter returned, this time louder, closer. I spun around, but the hall was empty. The lights overhead flickered, casting long shadows that danced on the walls. I felt a hand brush against my arm, cold and light, but when I looked, there was no one there. Panic gripped me, and I broke into a run, desperate to get out of the school. But the schoolhouse didn't want me to leave. The doors I had entered through were locked, the windows too high to climb. I was trapped, and the ghosts of the children were growing bolder. Their laughter echoed through the halls, followed by the sound of desks being dragged across the floor, as if they were preparing for class. I stumbled into one of the classrooms, and there, written in chalk on the blackboard, was a message: "We're still here." Terrified, I backed out of the room, my hands shaking. I had to find another way out. I bolted down the hall, my footsteps echoing against the cracked tiles. The ghosts weren't just watching me. They were toying with me, pulling me deeper into their world. And then I saw her, the teacher again, standing at the end of the hall, her face pale and expressionless. She raised a hand, as if beckoning me forward. But I knew if I followed, I might never leave. In a final burst of panic, I forced open a side door and stumbled out into the cool night air. I didn't stop running until I was far from the school, the laughter and whispers fading into the distance. I never went back, and I never told anyone what had happened. But sometimes late at night, I still hear the faint sound of children laughing in my dreams. And I wonder if the ghosts of that abandoned schoolhouse are still waiting for someone else to come play. When we bought the house near Moonlit Hill, we didn't think much about the local folklore. It was just a story, after all, a witch executed centuries ago, her curse lingering over the land. The house itself was remote, nestled in the woods, and we were excited to get away from the city for a while. It wasn't until after we moved in that we began to notice strange things. The first night, I woke to the sound of chanting outside. It was faint, almost like a distant echo, but it was unmistakable. I brushed it off as wind through the trees, though it left me uneasy. Over the next few days, the chanting continued, always late at night. At first, my friends didn't believe me, but soon they started hearing it too. We explored the house and found strange symbols carved into the walls, symbols none of us recognized, but they looked ancient. It felt like the house was hiding secrets, but none of us dared to ask what those secrets were. We laughed it off during the day, but the nights became more chilling as the chanting grew louder. Then, one of us, Rachel, started to feel ill. It came on suddenly. She complained of headaches, nausea, and a strange heaviness in her chest. We didn't think much of it at first, but as her condition worsened, we grew more worried. Doctors couldn't explain it, and no medicine seemed to help. The atmosphere in the house grew darker, the air thicker, and we couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The witch's legend, which we had once dismissed, now hung over us like a shadow. One night, I woke to find Rachel standing in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. Her eyes were glazed over, and she was muttering under her breath, chanting, just like the voices we'd heard outside. I called her name, but she didn't respond. When I shook her, she snapped out of it, confused and frightened, with no memory of what she'd been doing. That's when we knew we had disturbed something far more sinister than we had imagined. We started digging into the local history, talking to townspeople, and searching through old records. The legend of the witch was more than just a story. She had been executed on Moonlit Hill after being accused of cursing the town. They said she had vowed revenge on anyone who dared set foot on her land, and her spirit still roamed the woods, seeking those who disturbed her rest. The symbols in our house matched those found on her grave, and it became clear that we had somehow awakened her. The haunting escalated. The chanting, once outside, now echoed through the house, filling every room with a chilling, otherworldly sound. Strange symbols appeared on the walls overnight, even though we hadn't touched them. Objects moved on their own, and the temperature in the house dropped to freezing, even in the middle of summer. We were trapped, unable to leave as Rachel's illness worsened. Desperate, we sought help from a local historian who specialized in folklore. He told us that the witch's curse was real, and that she was still seeking vengeance. The only way to break the curse was to find the spot where she had been executed and perform a cleansing ritual. It sounded ridiculous, but at this point, we were willing to try anything. The historian gave us instructions and warned us to be careful. The witch's spirit was powerful, and if we made a mistake, we could make things worse. That night, we ventured up to Moonlit Hill, the air heavy with the threat of a storm. The chanting followed us through the woods, growing louder with each step. When we reached the hilltop, we found the witch's grave, a crumbling, moss-covered stone marked with the same symbols we had seen in the house. We set up for the ritual, following the historian's instructions to the letter, but as soon as we began, the wind picked up, howling through the trees. The air grew colder, and we could feel her presence, watching us, furious that we had dared to disturb her. Rachel collapsed, writhing in pain, and the chanting grew deafening. We pressed on with the ritual, reciting the words we had been given, our voices barely audible over the wind. The ground beneath us shook, and for a moment, I thought we had failed. But then, as suddenly as it had started, the wind stopped. The chanting faded, and the air grew still. Rachel's breathing slowed, and the heaviness lifted from the air. We had done it. The curse had been broken. We left Moonlit Hill that night, shaken but alive. Back at the house, the symbols had disappeared, and the air felt lighter, as if the witch's presence had finally left. We packed up and left the house for good, never looking back. But sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the faint sound of chanting in the distance. And I wonder if the witch's curse was truly lifted, or if she's just waiting for her next victim. When I first took the job at Stonegate Manor, I thought it would be easy, just cataloging antiques in an old, forgotten mansion. The place had been abandoned for years, but the owner had finally decided to sell it, and they needed someone to go through everything. I've always loved history, so I jumped at the chance. But from the moment I stepped inside, something felt wrong. The house was beautiful, in a haunting way, but there was a heaviness in the air, like the walls were holding on to secrets. Little did I know, Stonegate Manor had more than just antiques hidden away. The first night I stayed late, I started hearing strange noises. At first, it was faint, a creak here, a shuffle there. Old houses make noises, I told myself, so I didn't think much of it. But then I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the room above me. I knew I was the only one in the house, but it felt like someone, or something, was walking around. My skin prickled, but I ignored it and kept working. Maybe the house was settling, I thought, trying to convince myself. As I continued cataloging, I found a bundle of old letters hidden in the wall behind a painting. They were faded with age, written by the original owner, a wealthy businessman named Henry Langford. The letters were strange, filled with mentions of secrets and betrayal, as if Henry had been hiding something before his death. The more I read, the more it became clear he hadn't died of natural causes. The letters hinted that someone in the house had killed him, though the truth had never been uncovered. It was chilling to realize that this wasn't just an old house, it was the scene of a crime. After I found the letters, the atmosphere in the house changed. The noises at night grew louder. Footsteps, whispers, even the sound of someone pacing back and forth in the rooms above. The temperature would drop suddenly, and cold spots followed me as I moved from room to room. I could feel eyes on me, watching, waiting. It was as if the house knew I had discovered something, and it wasn't happy about it. One night, while working late, I heard a door slam upstairs. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made my way up the grand staircase. The hallways were dark, and the light from my flashlight barely pierced the shadows. As I approached the room where I'd heard the door, I saw it. Henry Langford's ghost, standing at the window, staring out into the night. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, and though I was terrified, I couldn't move. He turned slowly, locking his empty gaze on me, and then he was gone. After that night, I knew Henry's spirit was still in the house, bound by the secrets that had led to his death. I began researching his life, determined to uncover the truth. As I dug deeper into the mansion's history, I learned that Henry had been involved in a scandal before his death. He had been betrayed by someone close to him, his business partner, perhaps, or even a family member. But the mystery of who had killed him remained unsolved, and it was clear that Henry's spirit wouldn't rest until the truth was revealed. The hauntings intensified. I'd hear Henry's voice, a faint whisper in the dead of night, pleading for justice. Objects would move on their own, doors would open and close without warning, and the pacing upstairs never stopped. It was as if Henry was trapped in a loop, endlessly reliving the final moments of his life. The more I uncovered, the more dangerous the hauntings became. It felt like the house itself was alive, angry that I was getting closer to the truth. Then, one night, I found the final piece of the puzzle. Hidden behind a loose floorboard in the library was Henry's journal. In it, he detailed his suspicions about those around him, how he had grown paranoid, fearing that someone would betray him. The last entry was the most chilling. "I know they will come for me soon. If I die, the truth will be buried with me." The journal confirmed what I had feared. Henry had been murdered, and his killer had gotten away with it. With the journal in hand, I performed a small ritual I had read about in an old book on hauntings. It was supposed to help spirits find peace. But as I spoke the words, the house seemed to react. The lights flickered, and the air grew heavy, as if the house was fighting back. But then, just as quickly, it stopped. The cold spots vanished, the footsteps ceased, and for the first time since I had arrived, the house was silent. I left Stonegate Manor that night, leaving the letters and journal with the local authorities. The truth about Henry Langford's death had finally been uncovered, and with it, the spirit haunting the house had been set free. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the house still held secrets, that its walls had witnessed things no one would ever know. As I drove away, I glanced back at the manor, its dark silhouette looming against the night sky. I knew I'd never return. When my husband and I moved into the historic house near Cedar Hollow, we were excited to start our new life together. It was a beautiful home, tucked away in a quiet countryside, perfect for newlyweds like us. The locals spoke of its charm, but they also whispered about the tragic history that clung to the place. They said a bride had once lived there, a woman who had died mysteriously on her wedding night. At first, we shrugged it off as a ghost story meant to scare newcomers. Little did we know, the legend was more than just a tale, it was a warning. It didn't take long for strange things to start happening. As we unpacked, small items related to our wedding, our rings, the guest book, even our wedding photos, began disappearing. We thought it was just the chaos of moving in, but the more we searched, the more unnerving it became. One evening, while sorting through boxes, I noticed something chilling. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure. A woman in a tattered wedding dress, standing in the doorway. When I turned to look, she was gone, but the air in the room had grown cold. The following nights grew more disturbing. I'd hear soft footsteps outside our bedroom door, followed by the faint rustle of fabric, like a gown sweeping across the floor. My husband didn't believe me at first, chalking it up to the house settling, but when he heard the noises too, we both knew something was very wrong. The presence in the house felt heavy, as though someone was watching us, waiting, and the smell, an overwhelming scent of decaying flowers, began filling the house at odd times, as if something was rotting in the walls. One night I woke in the middle of the night to find the bedroom window open, though we had locked it before going to bed. As I approached to close it, I saw her again. The bride. She was standing in the yard, staring up at me with hollow, lifeless eyes. Her dress, once white, was now dirty and torn, and her face was pale, almost translucent. My heart raced as she slowly raised her hand, pointing directly at me. I slammed the window shut, shaking with fear. We began researching the house's history, desperate to understand what was happening. We found out that over a century ago, the house had been home to a couple who had married there. But on their wedding night, the bride was found dead, her body cold and lifeless in the bridal suite. The cause of her death was never determined, and rumors spread about a curse that followed anyone who married in the house. The bride's spirit, they said, still lingered, angry and vengeful. As the days passed, the haunting grew more intense. The bride's presence was inescapable. Every mirror in the house showed glimpses of her standing just behind us, her hollow eyes watching our every move. I started waking up in the middle of the night, feeling her cold breath on the back of my neck, as though she was right there in the room with us. My husband, too, began seeing her, and the tension between us grew as we struggled to figure out what she wanted. One evening, I found a note slipped under our bedroom door, written in a delicate, old-fashioned script, "You're next." My blood ran cold as I realized the bride's spirit wasn't just haunting us, she was trying to claim us. The curse that had taken her life was now reaching out for us, and if we didn't act soon, we would suffer the same fate. We sought out a local medium, hoping she could help us communicate with the bride and put her spirit to rest. The medium arrived, her face grim, and immediately sensed the dark energy in the house. She told us that the bride had been betrayed on her wedding night. Her groom had left her for another, and in her despair, she had taken her own life. Her spirit, bound by the pain and betrayal, cursed the house, vowing to punish anyone who dared marry there. The medium performed a ritual to cleanse the house, but as she began, the temperature dropped, and the bride's figure appeared again, this time in the middle of the room. Her expression was twisted with anger, and the windows rattled as though the house itself was shaking. "Leave," she hissed, her voice echoing through the walls. The medium chanted louder, and slowly the bride began to fade, her figure dissolving into a cloud of mist. When the ritual was over, the house was still, but we knew the bride's spirit wasn't entirely gone. We left Cedar Hollow the next day, unwilling to spend another night in that cursed house. Even now, I can still feel her cold eyes on me when I close my eyes, and I sometimes wonder if the curse will follow us wherever we go. The house remains empty, but the locals say they still see her standing by the window, waiting for her next victim. Some stories, it seems, never die.